One day, a gate appeared in the world. A similar phenomenon is observed in every corner of the world, a ubiquitous phenomenon that is harmless to the human body. But their exact purpose was never revealed, and the number of citizens expressing concern continues to grow. Meanwhile, in scientific circles, everyone is trying to figure out whether this phenomenon is connected with the unfortunate appearance and disappearance of monsters. Somewhere the loaders must have finished loading. The woman told the man that this was the last kitchen set, and she had a box in her hands. The man replied that there was still time, so they could take a break. The woman turned around and asked someone if he heard. The young guy, holding a box on the relay, answered that he understood. The man then asked the guy's name again. His name was Eugene, and then repeated it again, to which he said that he had just moved the last box. The man then threw a bottle into the boy's hands and asked him if it was hard for him, and the woman noticed that the young man was so diligent and how strong his hands were. Eugene only laughed awkwardly in response, opening a bottle of water. The man asked the guy why he was working there, whether he needed to pay for college or something, to which Eugene replied that he was paying for his brother's education. And then he said that their parents died early. They only had each other left, and therefore he had to drop out of university and go to work. The woman exclaimed that so much suffering had befallen him. The guy said that there was no suffering, and then took out his phone, showing a photo of his brother. The woman noticed that the guy's brother was so handsome and neat, and Eugene said that he was also taller than him. And then Eugene began to praise his brother. Eugene chattered enthusiastically as he talked about his brother, and the man remarked that he always became like that whenever his brother was mentioned. Eugene smiled happily and said that his rank classes were ending today too. That's why after work he will immediately go to his place to eat meat. Meanwhile, Eugene's brother was sitting by the window on the bus. He looked out the window, where the sun was already setting. Above the bridge, one could see those very gates. Eugene said that work increased due to moving, and then he said that it was all for the prosperity of his bosses, and the woman noticed that he also spoke beautifully, and the man said that it was all because of that thing and looked out the window of the truck. Eugene also looked out the window asking what that thing was, and the man said he was talking about that thing, and pointed his finger at the gate. She said that many people are now moving because of this thing because it makes them sick. I would like to know what it is. Leaning out of the car, Eugene noticed that his brother said that he had also seen some of these on his way to school. The woman asked if it was something good, if it was worth buying a house here. The man and woman continued to talk, but then Eugene raised his head, and he asked if it had always been that color. As it turned out, the gates were now glowing red instead of the usual blue. And then the truck suddenly stopped abruptly. The man and woman immediately wondered what it was, and whether someone had crashed into them. Eugene hurried out of the car to check his things. As he got out of the car, he noticed that there was some kind of bird-like creature sitting on the truck, drooling from its mouth. Noticing her, Eugene froze in shock, and the bird turned its gaze to him. And then she screamed loudly, and then hurried to run straight into the guy. Eugene managed to dodge, falling onto the asphalt, and the monster crashed into the car, tearing off the door. The monster climbed into the cabin and attacked the people in it, causing them to scream in fear. The screams continued, and Eugene sat on the ground, unable to do anything because of fear. As it turned out, these monsters were flying out of the gates, causing people to run away in panic. It turned out that the gate was connected to the dungeon, another world, through which monsters from it entered the world. An uncleaned and abandoned dungeon bursts when it reaches overflow. Dungeon break. The moment when the dungeon breaks and demonic beasts come out, and in a state of simultaneous dungeon strikes, only in their country hundreds of people were injured. Many died. Eugene jumped to his feet and grabbed some kind of iron rod. Coming closer, he shouted to the lizard to come out of there immediately. He was about to threaten her with his stick, but then he noticed something. As it turned out, someone's strong hands were squeezing the monster's jaws, and surprisingly, it was Eugene's boss. The woman screamed at her husband to take advantage of the moment and get out, and the man asked what was wrong with her hands. The woman replied that she didn't know either. The power appeared on its own, and people appeared who were awakened and had abilities when confronted with monsters. They became monster hunters. They were the ones who were destined to clear out dungeons. Hunter soon became one of the most sought-after professions. Meanwhile, that same monster was lying on the bridge, and his entire body was on fire. People watched someone with awe and shock. A young man stood on the bird's corpse, his shirt tattered. A pitch-black flame was burning from his palms. As it turned out, it was on this day that Oliver, Eugene's brother, became an S-class hunter, of which there are only a few in the world. 8 years have passed since that day. The girl raised her hand, and a green glow shone above her palm, in which one could see circles, and she asked if they saw anything. The reporter said she couldn't see anything, and the girl replied that it was a state window that only she could see. She said she first wondered if she was in a game, and then she said that in this status window there is a list of skills that she can use, and then she pressed her palms to the floor and roots began to creep out from her hands in all directions. The trees spread out across the room, and the reporter asked if she really used this ability to save people. The reporter said that 8 years ago during the dungeon the girl was looking for work. Awakening her wooden vine skill, she saved the citizens from the falling building. The girl laughed and said that she was in a hurry and somehow didn't notice. She continued by saying that she later chose the profession of a hunter and now clears dungeons as part of a small guild. Another woman said that the extra items she gets from dungeons also cost money. It's a bit dangerous, but it's better than any other job. And A-class dungeons can be considered a goldmine. New material from dungeons that did not exist in the world before are magic stones. Their cost ranges from several hundred to several billion. And hunters get good money for these stones, especially for stones from high-ranking dungeons. Especially famous in their country is the hunter Oliver, who was still a schoolboy at the time of the awakening. He lost his parents as a child and grew up in poverty, and after awakening, he founded the Abyss Guild and takes the position of the youngest guild leader. He is currently 25 years old and is said to be in a state beyond imagination. The reporter asked the girl if she had also become rich, to which she replied that she was only an E-class, and then she said that if she continued to work she would save up and she would like to save money for the education of the younger ones. This was the last interview of this hunter. She died while clearing the dungeon. She was taken to hospital at dawn this morning but was unable to recover. The news said that as attractive as the job of a hunter is, it is also dangerous. The guy sat with his head down on his knees, empty bottles of alcohol scattered around him. Meanwhile, a crowd of people had gathered near the next gate. Some guy called a man and then asked him why he brought such a man with him. As it turned out, he was talking about Eugene, who was an F-class hunter, nicknamed the Educator. And there were crutches lying next to him. Removing the mask from his face, Eugene noticed that he was famous, and then he told the guy to be lenient, because this is what he does for a living too, but that didn't soften the guy. The man put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said that few hunters would respond to such a small reward. But the guy replied that he was a magnet for trouble, because everyone else who was with him died. Eugene began to rub his hands nervously when the boy said that he was even abandoned by his incomparable younger brother. He went to his phone to find an article that said he never even visited him once when his leg was ground into powder. But then Eugene rose to his feet and grabbed the guy by the collar, and then he told him to shut up already. With wild eyes, he said that it was none of his business or anyone else's. The guy raised his hands and asked Eugene if he was angry, and then he kicked him in the chest, asking where he had lost his fear to attack like that. And now Eugene found himself grabbed by the collar. The guy asked him if he felt a difference in strength, and then he said that some F rank doesn't dare to bother him. Throwing Eugene to the ground, he told him to complain to his brother if he was so offended. Sitting on the ground, Eugene raised his hand, clearing his throat. Then someone raised a hand to him, from which yellow magic circles appeared. The man's hand glowed over Eugene's knee as he began to heal it. He said that he strengthened the frame, this is his ability, and although he cannot cure his leg, he will be able to move it easily for a few hours. And then he told the guy not to take those words to heart because it was absolutely pointless. The man continued by saying that he was an F class, so he would have to rely on someone one way or another, and so he just had to be patient. And in response to this, Eugene raised his head and smiled brightly at the man. Taking the man's hand to help him up, the boy said he was already grateful that they were taking him with them. Eugene said cordially that his boss was working so hard to reconcile them all. In response, the man smiled awkwardly, thanked her, and said that, as expected, he was the only one who noticed it. Eugene simply looked at the man's face with a smile, but he himself thought that he had been caught. Eugene began to rise to his feet. He lowered his hand to pick up his cap that was lying on the ground, and suddenly screams were heard somewhere. As it turned out, it was the man who hit the guy on the back of the head who was bullying Eugene, shouting at him to stop it, because Eugene is insanely fast, and he is familiar with dungeons firsthand. Leaning on his crutches, Eugene raised his hand a little higher, and a blue hexagon lit up above his palm, and the guy mentally used the subject upbringing check. A window appeared above the man's head, stating that guild leader Scott had been added to the training targets. The guild had already set off for the dungeon, and Eugene, approaching closer, thought that all these nicknames might be true, because he had always survived thanks to this skill. The men entered the dungeon, which looked abandoned for a long time, with vines growing along the ancient stone walls. From the depths of the room, monsters that looked like bats suddenly flew out. People immediately rushed to attack, attacking the monsters with explosions. Some defended themselves with a shield. At the back were people with support abilities who healed and strengthened others from afar. Someone said that they shouldn't let their guard down, to which someone else replied that this was a D-class dungeon, and that someone incredible couldn't possibly come out of it. There were already dead monsters lying on the ground when someone said that before they would shudder just from the sight of such creatures. The monster's body suddenly dissolved, leaving behind a small glowing stone that lay in a pool of blood. Scott picked up the stone, noting that he didn't expect them to earn that much. A guy came up to him and said that with that size, even a D-rank stone would be expensive. And then he called out to Eugene, who was mining with a pickaxe, and he reminded him that 80% of his production would go to commission. Eugene turned around holding a small stone in his hand, and he said that there was nothing more serious than this waste. To which they replied that the magic stones of their monsters were their prey, and if he did not want to die of hunger, then he should dig hard. Eugene felt like he was Cinderella being ordered around by her older sisters, and the boy continued by saying that if he was caught hiding anything, he would be stripped naked and hung on the pillory. Still, Eugene began to diligently hammer his pick into the stone, cursing and saying that these bastards were treating him like cheap labor. He started singing to amuse himself, but he sang about how he was no different from Cinderella. The boy stopped, sadly singing about how he was a young orphan, and then he thought that he had lost his parents. Even his younger brother had turned away from him, and after waking up, he left home. And he didn't listen to him when he asked him to stop, when he said that it was dangerous. And while Eugene was in the army, his brother Oliver gathered hunters around him and created the Abyss Guild. As the Abyss became recognized as the strongest guild in the country, Oliver became more and more unattainable, and the abandoned Eugene was left behind. Eugene's head was filled with thoughts of what might happen if he, too, awakened as he wanted to awaken. Having spent all the money he had left after quitting his job, he found a broker who promised to wake him up. He fell for their flattering promises that they would take care of him since he was an S-class brother. He did a lot of dirty deeds, after which, although late, he woke up, but he woke up only as an F rank. People began to whisper, discussing the fact that Eugene had been knocking on doors, begging to be accepted into the Abyss. Someone told him that they believed him. Since he called himself the elder brother of the Abyss, they supported him, so now he must repay them everything. Eugene's name was now constantly on everyone's lips in the press, and he himself found himself in debt. Oliver, coming to him one day, asked him how long he would make him clean up after him. He said that his nickname, which he received upon awakening, was Educator, because he educated the S-class. Oliver asked him if he was ashamed of such a nickname. Leaning towards his ear, he said that he was not a teacher, but someone who only bound his hands and feet. Eugene was injured time and time again in the dungeon. He could no longer even use his leg, and Oliver refused to help him, providing the help of a doctor. Oliver said that everything should work out well, because he won't encounter any more troubles in the dungeons. Turning around, he asked his brother to live quietly from now on, and to stop tying his hands and feet. Meanwhile, Eugene, lost in his memories, hit the ground with his pickaxe. A blank expression appeared on his face as he stopped and stared at the ground. He sighed and quietly said that he deserved to be abandoned. After all, he is the feeble older brother of a magnificent S-class hunter. He is a parasite trying to extract all the benefits from him, and this is not a delusion. And the fact that he is F rank, always surviving in dungeons where people constantly die, is not his merit. It is only due to his skill that he extracts benefit from others. The ability given to him upon awakening allowed him to influence those around him. He could influence those who were as close to him as his own family member, whom he personally cared for and raised. But he could also influence people with whom he met and became friends. If he applies his code word to such subjects, they become his pupils. And then he could add small enhancements to his pupils, which was his main skill. Eugene wondered if he could possibly survive with something like that at the bottom, even if he was a pure support. He's just a cave grasshopper, a parasite who survived alone even when all the other members of the team were dying. But he survived not because he was lucky, and not because he was in the rear. In fact, the Educator has another hidden skill that has saved him in every crisis. Suddenly, a notification rang in Eugene's ear, informing him that the effect of the Educator title was being activated, and the additional skill, Final Retribution, was being launched. The guy didn't expect his skill to work, but a message immediately appeared stating that the skills and abilities of the object of education are transferred in double volume. And the guy's hands, which were holding the pickaxe, suddenly glowed with a bright light. Eugene looked at his hand and realized that power was flowing into his body. And this was precisely his boss's ability. A magic circle glowed above his palms, indicating that it was an enhancing ability. Eugene threw the pickaxe on the ground and grabbed his crutches, and then he quickly ran forward, not understanding how this was possible in a D-class dungeon. The hidden skill, Final Retribution, means that the abilities and skills of the pupil that was improved by him are temporarily transferred to Eugene with double the power. If his speed was 100, now he can run at 200. It is thanks to this skill that he constantly survived. Eugene stopped, stepping heavily onto the ground, and he thought that this was an incredibly bad skill. He opened his skill menu, and this skill was difficult because of the condition of its activation. After all, the condition for activating this skill is the death of the object. And since this ability has now been activated, that means Scott should already be dead. Eugene walked forward again, and his foot stepped on something red. Looking up, he saw Scott's lifeless body lying on the ground, with blood all around. Someone's screams were heard, which made Eugene turn around. As it turned out, these screams belonged to the guy who had previously bullied him. But now this guy was in the mouth of one of the heads of a huge lizard. But the guy was still alive. Even though his arm was torn off, he weakly said that it was impossible, because it was a dungeon of rank D. And then he cried out that it was all because of that bastard. Because of his bad omen, all because he got involved with him. And then the monster's jaws closed, breaking the guy's bones and tearing his flesh, causing him to let out shrill screams and his blood to flow down. Looking at the monster, Eugene thought that it was the king of poison and curse dragons, Rauchitus. Until now, no one has been able to defeat him because he belongs to the genus of dragons of the first class, meaning that elimination is impossible. What is such a monster doing here? Noticing a new victim, one of the dragon's heads darted towards Eugene, but he managed to run away, and therefore the monster's teeth only tore his jacket. The guy quickly used the leg enhancement ability, and his legs glowed with a bright light. And now he ran even faster, managing to break away from the monster by running into some kind of crevice. As he continued running, he thought that this was a boss enhancement skill, and now it had a double effect. He decided to use this speed to hide where the dragon could not enter. He decided to escape at any cost. But then the dragon decided to clear a path for himself, and he, waving his tail, broke the stone, stopping the guy. Eugene stopped just before the edge of the cliff that had been created by the impact. But the dragon did not calm down, and growling loudly, he was about to pounce on him again. Realizing that he had nowhere to run, Eugene decided to try to block the blow with his crutches, strengthening his arms. However, this was not successful, and the guy only quickly flew away, and his crutches flew in different directions. He fell head over heels to the ground, making a strangled sound. Blood began to drip onto the ground. The guy's body shook as he looked at his hand, which was covered in his blood. He thought that he was no match for this dragon, even with twice the skill strength of the boss. The guy began to be overwhelmed by his dying memories. He saw how the guy turned to the boss to say that he would try to buy time. But he didn't have time to finish speaking, and the dragon hit him with its tail, spraying his blood in all directions. Eugene's legs were out of order again, and he thought that he wouldn't be able to escape like this. Meanwhile, the dragon had gotten very close to him, preparing to kill him. Opening his mouth, he let out a monstrously loud roar, and drool flew from his mouth in all directions. Eugene closed his eyes tightly, awaiting his painful death in fear. But then something flew at the dragon, and a huge explosion thundered over his head. A figure grabbed the boy's body and put it away from the terrible monster. As it turned out, that man was Eugene's younger brother, Oliver, who was now holding his brother on his shoulder. Oliver carried his brother aside, placing him behind a rock to keep him safe. Eugene asked him what he was doing there, to which the boy only told him to stay behind. In response to this, Eugene only cried out that even he was not able to cope with the three-headed monster. But Oliver did not listen to his older brother's warnings, but only fearlessly turned to the dragon. Leaning forward, he said something, his voice barely above a whisper, activating his skill. And the blue willow leaves technique was activated, and many glowing leaves began to swirl around Oliver. Pushing off the ground, he jumped into the air and began to rush from side to side, striking with his sword. Gripping the blade tighter, he activated his other skill, and the blade of the sword began to glow with a dark light. With a wave of his hand, he stretched out the dark energy that flowed from the blade of the sword. The boy raised his hands, pointing his sword towards the monster, and dark energy swirled around the blade of the sword. Oliver threw a punch, causing a bright purple flash to erupt, illuminating everything around. Still sitting on the ground, Eugene watched the fight with interest, and he replied that the guy was very fast, looking at his brother, whose face had a serious, focused expression. He thought that this was a battle of the S-classes. But then Oliver's gaze darted frantically somewhere to the side. As it turned out, another dragon head appeared there, from whose mouth some kind of green liquid began to flow. and then this head spat out a funnel of this liquid, but Oliver managed to jump aside in time. Eugene's cry was heard, exclaiming that it was a deadly poison, from which even a healing potion would not save. Meanwhile, this very poison was flying towards Eugene himself. In the blink of an eye, Oliver was in front of his brother, activating a shield to protect the two of them from the poison. However, small drops of poison still fell on the boy's body. Eugene called out to his brother in fear, but he only looked forward sternly, once again pointing his sword. The boy swung his sword, cutting off two of the dragon's heads with one blow. However, after this blow, the blade began to melt with a loud hiss. Eugene looked at the blade of the sword in panic. Not understanding why his brother was here, Oliver went towards the dragon again to kill it, and Eugene wondered if it was acting like that because it was protecting him and therefore could not fight freely. Realizing this, the boy leaned forward to call his brother. Turning around, Oliver asked the guy why he went into the dungeon again. Was even a broken leg not enough to stop him? The guy screamed about how he was climbing without knowing his place and what it all led to, how long he planned to make him clean up after him. Oliver shouted at him irritably that he had already told him so many times to keep out of his way and live quietly. After a few moments, Eugene quietly asked if he had come here just to say that. Getting to his feet, he said that he had been wondering why he had come, and that he was afraid of being tied up by him again. Oliver shouted for him to go back to the corner. Everything inside Eugene froze, and he wondered if he really thought that he had come to save him just because he was his brother. The dragon flew away with a loud cry when Eugene asked if his brother was tired of it. He slowly dragged his feet along the ground as he walked forward. The boy raised his hand, under which a sword shone, and he asked if it irritated him that his older brother was always butting in, not knowing his place. Eugene said that his brother didn't have to come at all, because everything could have been done more simply. Turning around, Oliver screamed again for him to retreat, but Eugene didn't seem to hear him, and he just ran forward with a sword in his hands. Running up to the monster, he thrust his sword into its body. The dragon's head turned towards him when Oliver asked him what he was doing. Eugene released his grip and the blade fell to the ground as he asked if this was how it would end. The guy said resignedly that he would save him again, and he would become his shackles, so why not leave him here to die? He frowned, saying that for him, as for the one who died in the dungeon, there would not even be a need to arrange a funeral, and he himself thought that he was mortally tired, and then wondered when it had started. The dragon's mouth flew at the guy when he said that everyone would be happy with the abyss, so there was no need to worry anymore. Eugene spun around again, preparing to accept his death. Oliver, with a loud cry, quickly rushed to intercept. The monster's clawed paw almost closed on Eugene's body as Oliver flew towards him. Everything around was illuminated by an explosion of the guy's dark energy. Drops of blood fell to the ground. Eugene's eyes widened, realizing he didn't feel any pain, and then he looked away. His brother lay next to him, his back pierced by the dragon's claws, causing bloodstains on his coat. Oliver and Eugene were brothers who had no one else, and especially after the death of their parents, they had no one. Little Oliver, looking at his brother's lifeless face, asked him if he was all right. Eugene looked at the boy and smiled a weak smile, saying that everything was fine. In the whole world, they were the only ones who had each other. Meanwhile, the blood was increasingly ordered to the ground when Oliver asked his brother if he was okay. Eugene looked at his brother, trying to ask him something, but his voice was trembling traitorously. Meanwhile, one of the dragon's heads was engulfed in flames. The dragon, feeling extraordinary pain, opened its mouth, letting out a deafening roar. Coughing, Oliver sat up to tell his brother that Rauchidus fell asleep every 5 hours, and if he hid, he would fall asleep. Breathing heavily, Oliver turned to look at the monster and weakly told his brother to take advantage of the moment and run. Eugene thought that this couldn't be, because he had never visited him in the hospital when his leg was crushed. When he just wanted to help him, he pushed him away in the coldest possible way. He abandoned him, told him to keep a low profile and live quietly. And then he wondered why his brother was smiling at him now, holding out some stone. The boy put a stone in Eugene's hand, saying that with it he would be able to get out. And then he leaned forward heavily, falling into his brother's arms, saying that first they must take care of his wounds. Leaning on his brother, Oliver said that there was no point in this, and Eugene, hearing this, froze. Oliver looked at his brother's face with a smile, saying that he would not be able to use the gatestone. And then his hand loosened its grip and fell down. Oliver's body went limp, his head falling onto the shoulder of the guy holding him by the shoulders. A few moments later, Eugene called out to his brother, and the lights immediately began to flicker. Everything began to be illuminated by the light of these little lights, which became brighter and brighter. There have been reports that the educator effect is being displayed. The duration of the additional skill, Final Retribution, is 1 hour. Eugene's tears began to flow as his brother's skills were transferred to him in bright flashes. A whirlwind of shining flashes engulfed Eugene, who was holding his brother's body in his arms, while the dragon was preparing to attack again. And then, something shook the earth. The dragon's huge paw hit the ground, destroying it and shaking everything around. Embraced by the soft blue glow of the blue leaves, Eugene, with his brother in his arms, rose to his feet and then flew higher. When the earthquake ended, he landed back on the ground. Cursing, Eugene hugged Oliver's lifeless body tightly. His brother's dark energy glowed around his fingers. And then, from Oliver's chest, his shining blade appeared. Eugene took out the weapon and carefully laid his brother's body on the ground. He pressed himself against him again, holding the weapon out in front of him, saying that even now he was doing this to him. The enraged dragon rushed forward, and the guy just calmly rose to his feet. As the dragon came even closer, Eugene quickly jumped up, striking the weapon at its neck. Looking down, he noticed that it was too slow, and then he swung his spear, causing everything around him to become illuminated with a bright light as he cried out that he had twice the strength of his incredible brother. Eugene struck, and the dragon, bleeding, began to fall to the ground. And again memories began to penetrate the boy's head. And his brother said that since he had awakened as an F rank, he could not contact him. He thought about keeping him away, even further than he was now. If his brother became his weak spot, they would definitely target him. Meanwhile, Eugene rushed forward again. Rising again, the dragon met the guy with an angry cry and he only pushed away from his head. He jumped high into the air, throwing his spear arm back, and then he turned around to strike. In his mind, he had a picture of his brother's upbringing, where he told his subordinate to continue to observe and report. He said that by becoming a hunter, his brother would not be able to be properly protected by the law. When Eugene ended up in the hospital, Oliver blamed himself for not being able to stop it. He ordered his subordinates to deal with these bastards at all costs who did this to his brother's leg. In a bright flash, Eugene flew down, striking the dragon's food. Memories appeared again, namely about the day when he came to ask the doctor for help. Oliver ordered his subordinates to make it look like he was forced to help him financially just because they were brothers. Oliver pressed himself against the window, quietly saying that it would be better this way, because he would not go to the dungeon anymore. And then he sat down on the floor, exhausted, apologizing to his brother and praying that he would not go to the dungeon again. Finally, everything in the dungeon became quiet. It started to rain, and Eugene stood astride the huge carcass of a dragon, which was now definitely dead. The guy smiled weakly, asking who the bastard thought he was without even saying a word. Tears were streaming down the boy's cheeks as he leaned on his spear and said that he hadn't expected this. He had really broken him, tying his hands and feet. He noticed that the time of the last retribution was ending, and when time runs out, he too will die from the poison of Raucatus's internal fluids. The guy started thinking about what he had done if only he could change everything. And then a message appeared saying that an impossible achievement had happened. He had killed the dragon. A message has appeared stating that the legendary title, Dragon Slayer, is being awarded. The reward is 10 gate stones, 5 acquired Class 1 liquids, and the Great Sword of the Scarlet Dragon. And also a wishing stone is given out, which can fulfill any one wish, and a strange stone began to shine in front of the guy. Eugene stared at him in amazement, asking if he could really do anything. He then rushed forward to ask for his brother to be resurrected. But before he could finish speaking, a message appeared stating that the stone would do anything except resurrect the dead. Eugene fell to his knees, holding the stone in his hands, and he asked in a panic what he should wish for then. He wondered if he could become stronger than Oliver if he wished for it. He will be able to become what he wanted to be for so long, and maybe even more. But then he asked the wishing stone to turn back time, to return him to a time when his younger brother had not yet died. Eugene stood up, holding the stone in his hands. He said that he would no longer go to the dungeons and would live quietly, so let him return it in time before he woke up. A message appeared asking the guy if he was sure about his desire. Eugene's gaze softened, and he replied that he was sure his face was illuminated by the soft light of the wishing stone. And then the stone began to glow even brighter, and steam began to emanate from it in all directions. Eugene calmly closed his eyes, thinking that even if he regretted it, he would not allow something like this to happen again. And the next moment, Eugene jumped up, his eyes wide open. As it turned out, he was no longer in the dungeon, but sitting somewhere on the couch. Looking around, he realized that these were his brother's rear guilds. Looking at his body, he asked if he really had returned to the past. Taking out his phone, he looked at the date and noticed that he had gone back 5 years, and then wondered why he was in the Abyss building. And then he realized that he had hit the day when he found the Awakening Broker. He went, not suspecting that it was a scam, took the money with him, and then he was grabbed and dragged into the abyss. He thought that he would be able to catch up with his brother as soon as he woke up. Eugene leaned against the sofa, suddenly realizing that he was going to come here now. And at that very moment, someone's footsteps were heard outside the door. And then the door swung open, and a guy came into the room, telling his brother what he said. He asked him how much more he needed to repeat before he would allow himself to end up here. Eugene looked at his brother, his eyes immediately becoming moist. The only word that rang through his mind was back, as he rushed forward towards the boy. Eugene jumped up, wrapping his arms around his brother. Not understanding anything, Oliver called his brother. Eugene pressed himself against the guy, thinking what a relief it was that he was alive. And then he said a quiet, "Sorry." Without looking up, Eugene said that it was his fault. He had behaved so unreasonably. Oliver's eyes widened slightly as the boy continued, saying that he was sorry for both. For everything. Still dumbfounded, Oliver asked Eugene if he was going to get into more trouble, to which his brother shouted that he was not. And then he reached up to put his hand on the back of his brother's head, and he said he just thought about it on his way here. Eugene put his hand on the back of the boy's head and pulled him close, saying that he was only 20 years old now. And all this time he suffered so much alone and in the guild, and he, as the older brother, was long overdue to understand this earlier. Pulling back to look into his brother's face, Eugene said that he wouldn't make such a fuss anymore. He wouldn't give him any more headaches. Having recovered a little from the shock, Oliver hesitantly placed his hands on his brother's back, and he thanked him for these words. Eugene blushed a little and thought that this was such a relief, even though he felt a little ashamed now. He was glad that at least now everything could be returned back, and they were brothers who had no one but each other, and so they will remain. Eugene, again moving away from his brother, put his hand on his shoulder and with a joyful smile said that he loved him. He thought that now he would forget about awakening and the hunters, and would just sit quietly in his place. But then a message appeared that the recording of the awakened Eugene was complete. There were reports that the titles of Dragon Slayer and Ideal Educator were obtained. The additional skill, My Baby is the Best, was launched, and the growth rate of Oliver's fosterling was increased by 2 times. After a while, there was a saucepan on the stove in which something was cooking, and a frying pan in which eggs and bacon were being fried. Oliver, who was wearing an apron, turned to his brother and said that everything would be ready in a moment, so he should sit quietly. Eugene responded almost immediately, saying that he would do so. Sitting at the table, the guy felt this awkward atmosphere that was weighing on him. Earlier that day, before going back in time, they had another fight and Eugene simply ran away. Turning back, the guy stared at Oliver's back and thought that it was good that they made up. But he never expected that they would have dinner together. And then he thought that there was something more important right now, and he pointed his finger somewhere in the air, activating the status window. He thought about how he never expected to wake up again, and not like before. He was also surprised by this strange title of L-Class Dragon Slayer. He thought that he must have received it for killing Raucadus. However, why, when we went back in time, everything didn't turn out as if what happened had never happened. And besides, L-Class must mean legendary, which is even higher than S-Class, and Eugene poked at the icon of this rank. And then 4 round icons flew out from this rank, which belonged to his new skills. Among these skills were Poison Resistance, Curse Resistance, Fear Resistance, and they were all L-Class, which gave the guy resistance to legendary class poisons and curses. And there was also the SS-Class skill, Raucadus Predator. Assessing his new skills, Eugene wondered if he had become stronger since going back in time. Pictures of how everything could happen now immediately began to flash through his head. In the boy's fantasies, Raucadus was so strong that even Oliver admitted that he would not be able to cope with him, and that this was the end. But then he, the great Eugene, appeared before the guy, covering his brother with his body. Smiling, Eugene turned around and said that his brother had arrived, so everything was okay now. And then he said that this deadly poison was just a refreshing shower for a true hunter, and Oliver was stunned by his brother's coolness. Eugene thought that now he would become the strongest hunter and would be able to live like a king. And then he enthusiastically climbed into the status window to see what class he had become, expecting L or S class. However, for such high classes, his stats were too low. All of them were within 10 points. The guy noted with annoyance that he had become an F class again, and that he had no chance of defeating the dragon. He desperately grabbed his head, lowering his head to the table, and thought about how his body remained the same. How could he use all these skills? Looking again at the status window, he thought with disappointment that there was nothing unusual about him in this life either. His E-class agility and intelligence-enhancing skills are also similar to his previous skills. However, he noticed that his rank of educator had changed to L-class, By clicking on this title, he again summoned 4 skills that were highlighted in red. These skills were the L-class Last Gratitude, which Eugene decided was best not to use, while the other skill names seemed too disgusting to the guy. One of them was the skill My Baby is the Best, which provided accelerated growth of the object that was influenced by hearing the code word. The duration was 3 days. Eugene reasoned that this was very similar to the previous educator. And then he noticed in surprise that this skill accelerated the growth of the subject by as much as 2 times. He cried out in surprise about this, which made Oliver turn around. The next skill was the skill Our Child is So Incredible, which was activated by supporting the object of nurturing with a code word in front of more than 5 beings with intelligence that could perceive code words. And then the abilities and effect of the skills of the object of education increases relative to the number of living beings with intelligence, maximum 100%. Eugene thought that if he supported his brother in front of 50 people, he would become 1.5 times stronger. And if in front of 100, he would become twice as strong. And then with this skill, it's only a matter of time before he makes his brother the strongest. And not only him, but also the people in his guild. He began to fantasize about how he would raise the strongest hunters in the world and be able to bathe in money and adoration, to be at the top of this world. However, it turned out that the code word was love. Now Eugene began to bang his head on the table, not understanding why he had been given such a terrible code word. But then he realized that it had changed during his confession of love to his brother. Then the guy immediately thought about what would happen if he used this code word. He realized in despair that not only would he be considered strange, but he would also be arrested. Then he thought sadly that all these skills, considering the code word, were no good, and he couldn't use them, although the skills were quite good. The last skill Eugene decided to look at was Promising STEM. This skill was that he could check the supposed class of unawakened people, and subjects exposed to the code word could awaken with optimal talents. Eugene was busy thinking about how he could use such a skill, while Oliver finished cooking and put the pot on the table. He put some rice in a small plate and handed it to his brother, asking if he had enough rice. Eugene accepted the plate with joy, thanking his brother, and said that he would eat it all with pleasure. And Oliver, sitting down at the table, said that he cooked from what he had, so he did not know how it turned out. When Eugene tried the first boat, his face immediately lit up. And then he quietly said, not believing that it was very tasty. Oliver replied that he was then glad. And then, looking at his brother with a smile, he told him that there was still a lot left, and therefore, if he wanted more, he could safely ask. Continuing to devour Oliver's cooking, the boy said that he didn't even know his brother was such a good cook. Oliver replied that he had gotten the hang of it over the years, cooking for himself, and then Eugene asked him why he cooked for himself, since he had a lot of money. To which Oliver replied that it was much safer. Now there are various detoxifying and curse-removing items, but before there weren't any. Hearing this, Eugene froze. After a few moments, he quietly asked his brother if there were people who added Yal to his food or put curses on it. Oliver smiled sadly and simply said that he was performing alone and was therefore being held back. Other guilds grew by colluding with large corporations, but he did not join any and declared that he would create his own guild. Oliver said it would be a lot easier if he obediently walked into the appropriate guild. But then Eugene grabbed his brother by the cheeks, turning him around and interrupting him. Eugene cried out, asking why he, the bastard, had never told him about this before. Oliver, in response, looked away and told his brother to remove that expression from his face because he himself chose this path. And then he said that one thing tormented him, namely, that because of his behavior their relationship worsened. He followed him and interfered in every matter, trying to make sure that he did not catch their eye. He constantly deliberately distanced himself, afraid that they would touch his only brother. Eugene put his hand on his brother's shoulder and exclaimed that he should have just said it, to which his brother replied that he didn't mean to burden him. The smile fell from the boy's face as he continued, saying that he then felt like he wouldn't understand. And then he said that it turned out he was wrong, and he reached out to put his hand on the hand that was on his shoulder. Smiling again, Oliver said that his brother still thought about him and cared about him, and he also apologized and said that he loved him. The boy smiled brightly and happily, thanking his brother for saying so, despite how cruelly he had behaved. Feeling awkward about the fact that he was about to burst into tears, Eugene began frantically putting food on his brother's plate, saying that there was nothing to thank him for, since it was because of him that he had suffered so much. Afterwards, they had a pleasant time at dinner, and Eugene thought how good it was that he turned back time. It was the best choice he had ever made in life. After a while, Oliver's phone beeped. The guy looked at it and said that he had work, so he needed to go. As he rose from the table, He said that he wanted to say one more thing before he left. As he took off his apron, he told his brother to delete the broker's wake-up contact, and Eugene immediately reached for his phone. And the boy said that anyway, the broker wouldn't answer him now, even if he tried to contact him. As Eugene deleted the contact, he wondered if this meant his brother had gotten rid of those brokers, and Oliver watched closely. Oliver threw his coat over his shoulders and said that he would go now. Eugene waved his hand at him, saying that he would take care of the rest. Touching the door with his hand, Oliver asked him what he was talking about, and then he said that his brother would not go anywhere else. Smiling, he told him that now he would live here and would not have to go anywhere. Hearing this, Eugene froze somewhat frantically, comprehending his brother's words. And then he cried out, asking what this all meant. "He can't get out of here anymore?" Oliver, with a smile on his face, simply replied that it was dangerous outside and therefore he couldn't go out. Then, Eugene said that he walked around the area fine in the morning, there was nothing dangerous, scratching his chin. The guy replied that the situation was different from the morning. Now that they are close again, he is no longer as safe as he was before. He's been fine so far because he's kept him at a distance, but now his enemies are going to target him. There's no telling when they might try to take his life, so how can he let him roam around alone? With his arms outstretched, illuminated by a bright light, like an angel descending from heaven, Oliver said that from now on, his brother would only be here. And the next second, Eugene jumped out of his chair, screaming that he was crazy, and he quickly ran to the exit door. But suddenly bars appeared before his eyes, blocking his path, causing the guy to scream in fear. A voice called his name from behind him, and Eugene let out another cry of fear. The man handed the guy a document, and he said that they had transported everything he asked for here, and then asked him to sign the document. People immediately appeared and began to bring in boxes with Eugene's things. And Oliver said that even if his brother went home, there was nothing there. Now this was his home. A frightened Eugene screamed, asking his brother what he had done here. In response, the guy simply asked what was wrong with that. And then he said that he himself said that everything was fine. His brother apologized, said he loved him, accepted everything he had done so far. Oliver scratched his nose and said it was like he had gotten permission from his brother. Eugene's face darkened with annoyance and despair. And he thought about how this could mean something like that. After some time, Eugene was lying desperately on the floor among some of his things, scattered on the floor in boxes. Thinking about his brother's overprotectiveness, he wondered why he was acting like this, and if it was a side effect of going back in time. But then he came to his senses and, rising from the floor, he exclaimed that this was not the most important thing now. He began rummaging through the boxes of his belongings to grab the essentials and escape before his brother returned. Throwing his backpack over his shoulder, he walked towards the door, thinking that if he made a mistake, he would spend his whole life locked up. But, opening the door, he noticed that a huge man was standing in front of it, and the guy did not stop right away. The man frowned and asked the boy what he wanted. Eugene grabbed the door with his hand in fear and quietly greeted the man. As it turned out, the man was Steven, an A-class void hunter and Oliver's confidant with a powerful defensive skill. Eugene asked him if he would step out of the way for a moment, to which Steven replied that he could not, and his tone was such that there was no arguing. Steven put his hand out, pressing it against the half-open door, blocking the passage, and he said that the chief had ordered that they watch him so that he did not get out. Still, Eugene did not calm down and began to try to leave, shouting that he was only going for a short while, to which Steven, blocking his way, shouted back that he couldn't. The guy asked him what difference it made to him where he went. In response to this, the man only tiredly rubbed his face and sighed. He put his big hand on the guy's shoulder and said he wouldn't talk much. And then he told the guy to obediently return to the room, otherwise he would push him there, and a terrifying energy began to emanate from the man's body. The boy's entire body shook under Steven's large palms that lay on his shoulders, and he only made a strangled sound. He thought about it. It was as if he was suppressing his entire body, this special feeling of fear. In short, released by high-level hunters, he was like a herbivore standing in front of a predator. Still shaking, Eugene began to tell himself that he shouldn't be afraid. And then a message appeared that fear resistance was being activated. Suppression was cancelled. The skill began to take effect, and Eugene noticed that thanks to the skill, his trembling had disappeared. There were faint flashes of blue in Eugene's eyes before his fear disappeared completely. And now he thought that the formidable Steven now looked not like a predator, but like a meek puppy. And now, Eugene went into mad rabbit mode, and he grimaced, ordered the man to let him go, and then asked him what he was doing. Poking him in the chest with his finger, he asked him if he didn't know the laws of the Republic of Korea. And then he said that every person has the right to freedom, so locking him up here is a crime. He said that they really should go to the policeman's uncle, but then Steven grabbed him by the collar of his t-shirt. Lifting him off the ground, he said it was a punishment, and then he asked the boy if he wanted to be dragged to his room, to which the now resigned Eugene replied no, and then he apologized. He thought with resignation that, with or without skill, he was nothing. Steven began to push the guy back into the apartment, but then he hit the walls with his hands and feet. He began to frantically go through various options, thinking that he had so many skills, so he could do something. His gaze caught on the skill promising cutting, and the boy activated the skill. And then the guy turned around, grabbing the man by the face, and Eugene screamed, asking what was that there. Looking at the confused man's face, he saw his possible awakening level, his skills and characteristics. Eugene was surprised to find that Steven's possible awakening level was AS, meaning that there could be 2 S-class hunters in the abyss. Eugene began to pull the man by his ears and hair, thinking how pathetic it was. Couldn't he change it somehow? A message appeared stating that when raising an object in an incomplete state, after using the code word, it can use "my baby is the best" and obtain the S-class skills that were failed to obtain. After reading this, Eugene thought that he could solve the problem through education, because if he educated a man, then he would seem to obediently obey him. Having calmed down, Eugene decided to take advantage of this opportunity. But then he remembered that he needed to say the code word love. Steven's face looked extremely irritated when he asked what he was doing. You clearly can't tell someone like that you love him. But Eugene decided to try his luck and told him to look here. And then he decided to make a heart with his fingers. Steven looked at him in bewilderment. Then the guy decided to double his efforts and made a heart with both hands, and Steven started to get irritated again. He threw the guy into the apartment, telling him to stop these unpleasant gestures and come back. And Eugene mentally prayed that they would change his code word. A few hours later, it was already evening. Oliver entered the office. Looking at his brother, who was lying on the floor, he asked him if he had rested well, to which he replied that he was dying here. Picking his brother up from the floor, he asked him if he should move into his apartment since he didn't like it here. And then he said that he would give him a room. Eugene answered helplessly that he didn't care, because he would be locked in anyway. Oliver just sighed, and then he told him to cheer up, because he would soon let him out. Hearing this, Eugene really perked up, and he asked animatedly about when he could go out. Oliver awkwardly scratched his cheek and replied that the abyss was currently being held back by many enemies, but if they became the strongest, that problem would go away. So his brother needed to wait until they became the strongest. Eugene thought with annoyance that this would take several years in the future. Oliver took his brother's hand, saying that in a year he would already sweep away everything in his path, while Eugene, giving up his spirit, thought that it took more than 3 years. Meanwhile, Oliver continued by saying that sometimes he would let him go out, but only with Steven or him as security, and Eugene thought that it was like walking a dog. But then Oliver thought about the fact that it would be difficult to do this often, because he spends several days clearing dungeons, and he won't be able to trust it to anything below B class either. And then Eugene wondered if there was anything he could do about this with his abilities. A long time ago, he spent all day searching for information related to hunters, and so he clearly remembers who will become a high-ranking hunter. If he goes to them and appeases them, he will be able to awaken them, and as payment for awakening, he will make them his guards. If this way he becomes more authoritative, then Oliver too will be able to do whatever he pleases. And then Eugene happily jumped up and said that he would find an A-class hunter. Oliver just stared at his brother. Eugene was filled with the desire to find all the future hunters for himself. And since this is how it turned out, he needs to look for small children who are easy to convince. He will appease them well and raise them to be his personal hunters. Kneeling down, Eugene spread his arms, saying that he would find himself some A-class bodyguards, and then he should give him freedom. Then Oliver asked him how he would do it. In a panic, the guy began to talk about how he had different methods. Suspecting something, Oliver asked his brother if he had awakened. He ran up to him, asking various questions about his skill of being able to search for high-ranking hunters, worried that he would now be targeted even more. Eugene thought that he must not tell the truth under any circumstances, otherwise he would end up in eternal confinement. Giving up, he revealed that he was only an F-class. He said that he can determine the strong and weak class of the supposed awakening, and cannot do more than 1 awakening per month. Oliver reasoned that this would prevent his brother from becoming a target. And then he said that an alternative would soon appear, namely, a center for awakening, and the mechanism had already been revealed. Eugene scratched his face and realized that the center was not yet open at this time. And when he appears, then any person will be able to safely awaken, then the number of scammers will decrease, and there will be no people who could benefit from his skill. Smiling, Eugene quietly noted that everything had worked out well. He smiled happily and said that it was a useless skill, so there was nothing to worry about, and therefore he should just give it a chance. Oliver had already promised to give him freedom, but then he changed the subject, suggesting that they decide where he would move, and Eugene just jumped up happily. He thought that his brother wouldn't be able to keep him locked up because he would wipe out all the S-class hunters. He will quickly find them and grow his power, and so he will even be able to create a guild more serious than the Abyss. The next day, they went to the South Korean Association, the place where the Awakened were registered. People began to turn around, noticing Steven, the shield of the Abyss. Steven walked ahead, attracting all eyes, and Eugene walked behind. People started whispering about who was walking next to Steven and whether a new S-class had appeared. Within minutes, Eugene was registered as an F-class hunter. Eugene and Steven walked back, hearing discussions about why the guy was pretending to be an S-class. The guy thought that he had done the most important thing, so now he just had to pick up the equipment, and he looked at the envelope with money from Oliver. When he saw the amount of 1 billion won written on the envelope, he was so surprised that his eyes widened. Soon, he went up to the 6th floor where the hunting mall was located. He was immediately greeted by friendly consultants who asked him what equipment he would start with. They equipped him with various ability-enhancing equipment that looked like fancy jewelry, and then Eugene asked if they had anything simpler. Then he was offered Dark Elf earrings that increased mana by 29 points, and Eugene decided to buy himself these earrings. He also acquired simple leather gloves, which increased his stamina and strength, as well as a light belt, which increased his agility. Looking at the status window, he noticed that he now had C-class abilities. He quietly said that now he would use the remaining money to buy a contract, potions, and something else. But then Steven, who was standing by the car, asked the guy where he had gone. Having got into the car, Eugene reported that he had gone shopping and asked whether he was now not allowed to do that either, to which the man replied that he had to report where he was going. He said that since there was nothing else to do, they were going back. But then Eugene asked him to take him somewhere else. Looking out the window, he thought that the ice witch Penelope lived somewhere in this area. She lost her parents and lived with relatives who owned a meat restaurant. Penelope was an excellent hunter, even among Class A, so this level should satisfy Oliver. She awakened at 18, but she is still in middle school now. The guy thought that he needed to find her as soon as possible, sign a contract, and regain his freedom. It was already evening on the shopping street, and the lights of the shops were shining brightly. Eugene began asking people if they knew Penelope. However, everyone said that they didn't know the girl. Looking around, holding a corn dog in his hand, he said that there were more meat restaurants than he had expected. Would he really have to visit them all? He started to think about when all this would end, but then he smelled fried meat. Steven said that he was interested in why he came here, because there are meat restaurants near the Abyss, to which he only replied that he felt a strong energy here. The man muttered that it was all a scam, to which the boy shouted that he could hear everything. He calmly walked forward, but then a girl came out from around the corner, shouting that, of course, it was all her fault. Hearing this, Eugene looked up from his corn dog and looked ahead, and the girl screamed, asking how many times she had to be told that it wasn't her, but that bastard newbie. A man looked out into the passage and shouted at the girl to think about where she had figured it out, to which she only pulled off her apron, shouting that she hated all of this. And then, screaming that it would be easier to die, she ran forward. Looking at the girl's face, Eugene thought that he had found her. He tried to stop her, but Penelope had already run far away. Eugene handed Steven his corn dog, asking him to hold it. And then he ran forward, thinking about where the girl got such speed from, since she had not yet awakened. The belt on the guy's body glowed with a dim blue light, and Eugene's body quickly accelerated, supported by the power of the equipment. And the guy ran through the streets, creating a wind behind him and thinking that the equipment was the best thing in the world. He ran through the crowd trying to find the girl with his eyes, and then he finally noticed Penelope, who was running a little ahead. And then he called out to her, asking her if she was Penelope, which made the girl turn around. Eugene told her that they needed to talk for a while, and Penelope stopped and asked if her uncle had sent him. And then she ran again, saying that she would not return, and Eugene shouted after her to stop. Penelope ran out onto the road, and immediately a car began to approach her, and the girl stopped. Before the car could hit her, Eugene ran up and pushed away from the car, pushing Penelope out of the way, and they tumbled head over heels along the sidewalk. The driver sat in horror behind the wheel of the already stopped car. The crowd stopped to look at the two. Eugene asked the girl if she was hurt, and afterwards he said that he would have liked the ending to be more exciting. As it turned out, Eugene was sprawled on the ground, and Penelope was sitting on top of him. And she asked him if he was really a hunter, to which he only told her to get off him. After some time, they reached a meat restaurant. Meat was frying with a crackling sound on the stove. Eugene exclaimed happily, saying that he hadn't eaten marbled beef for so long. He told Penelope that she was sitting opposite him and eating her fill, so that she could eat her fill, and he thought how good it was that he was paying with a co-op card. And then he asked her if she could eat there, since her uncle had his own meat restaurant, to which she replied that it was not tasty there, and advised him not to go there either. And then she said that he would rather tell her something else, and then she noticed that he told her that he was the elder brother of the Abyss. And then she asked why such a person needed her. Smiling, Eugene replied that it was because there was good energy coming from it. Getting up from the table, Penelope said that she didn't believe it at all and thanked him for the food. And then Eugene made up a story about how he knew her parents and they helped him when his parents passed away. The guy frantically began to tell her that, although he was late, he had come to pay off his debt. Otherwise, he felt so awkward. Chewing again, Penelope sighed and said that she didn't care, because she already had people who would wipe away her drool and give her a slap on the back of the head. While putting the meat on the plate, Eugene said that he was thinking about how to help her, and then his strength turned out to be outstanding. And he said that he had the power to awaken other people, and then he told Penelope that she could be at least a B class. Eugene continued by saying that he was also under the protection of the Abyss, so he could help her get a job there as a hunter. And he, if she doesn't mind, wants to become her sponsor. He extended his hand to her, asking what she thought, if she wanted to make a contract with him and become a huntress. Penelope looked at the man in surprise and asked if she could really become a huntress. Eugene thought that among teenagers this profession is considered the coolest. He thought that he needed to put on some kind of show to entice her, and blue circles began to glow above his hand. And then a shining roll of paper and a brush appeared in front of him, and the guy asked if the girl would sign the contract. Penelope jumped up from her chair and asked where he got it from, if he really had some kind of inventory, to which the guy replied that she could do the same, and that this contract was also a special thing, created from dungeon items. Having written something on it, he threw it to the girl. Having caught it, she looked at it with reverence, and Eugene said that all that remained for her was to sign the contract. Penelope read aloud a couple of conditions, which stated that she would have to make a contract with the Abyss to keep Eugene's skill a secret and be responsible for guarding it for a year. The guy said that he is just a weak F class, so he needs a bodyguard. But then Penelope asked him if he would be ashamed to be under the protection of a high school student. Eugene replied that after awakening, she would become much stronger than him. So no. And then the girl asked if she would be able to become independent after awakening. She looked sadly at the table when Eugene asked again. And then he said that it was generally possible, awakened minors on an equal basis with adults. And then the girl said that she would sign the contract. But then Eugene grabbed the brush that was in her hand. And then he said that everything needs to be checked, and her conditions are not yet in this contract. Eugene began to show her something in the contract, saying that this way she could have been deceived. Taking the contract, he said that the execution of the contract needed to be carefully monitored, so she still needed a guardian. And the girl's face immediately darkened. Eugene said that he shouldn't be fooled by the attractive independence. But then Penelope asked him about what if this guardian was deceiving her. Looking at the girl, Eugene asked what she was talking about. Looking away, the girl exclaimed that they would simply take everything away from her, instead of monitoring her performance. She clutched her shirt tightly in frustration and anger, and suddenly someone's cry was heard, asking where Penelope was. As it turned out, it was Penelope's uncle who shouted angrily that he had been told that she was here. Eugene stood up from the table to greet and introduce himself, but the man didn't listen to him, and only yelled at the girl for not doing what she should, and for also hanging out somewhere. He grabbed the girl's hand to lead her away, and then Eugene exclaimed, stopping the man. And then he grabbed his arm, stopping him. Finally, the man noticed the guy and he asked him who he was, how close he was with this girl. To which the guy replied that everything was not like that at all. Eugene squeezed the man's hand hard, and Penelope stepped back a little, rubbing her hand. Penelope's uncle began to shout to be let go, and Eugene turned to look at the girl. She stood with her back to it, frowning and looking somewhere at the floor. Her sneakers were so worn out that they were practically falling apart. Turning back to the man, Eugene said quietly that he now understood what she meant, and he asked her if she wanted to say that nothing was better than such a guardian. And Penelope actively screamed that everything was so, and her uncle was the worst. She pointed her finger at him and screamed that he had appropriated her parents' inheritance and was not giving her a penny for pocket money. She exclaimed that he once gave her only a cheap plastic umbrella, and when it fell apart she had to cover herself with a plastic bag. And people in the restaurant started turning around. The man frowned even more and said that she was always just disgracing people. The man pushed Eugene away from him and walked forward towards Penelope, and then Eugene suddenly fell to the floor. Penelope and her uncle stared at the boy in complete shock. Eugene was sitting on the floor when a worried Penelope asked if he was okay. And a moment later, Eugene began to writhe wildly on the floor, screaming that this uncle was beating people. He sat down on the floor and said that they could have had a normal conversation, so why did he push him? Tears streamed down the boy's cheeks as he said he just stopped the girl. Eugene continued his acting and cried out, asking if he was going to hit the girl too. Grabbing the guy by the clothes, he jumped up, saying that he was brazenly turning the situation around. But then Eugene tripped the man, and the man instantly flew forward face down on the table. Standing up, Eugene, holding a soda in his hand, said that they should be careful because the floors were slippery. There were crumbs of food on the man's face when he turned to look at the boy. But then Eugene again pushed the man face down into the table. He asked him worriedly if he had slipped again, while Penelope chuckled quietly behind him. Eugene brought the man's face to the grill, asking him how he was not ashamed to steal from a child. The man screamed in panic. Frowning, Eugene said that he would destroy him if he misbehaved with the girl again. Penelope exclaimed that this BAM sound was just like in wrestling, to which the guy said that this sound was not from him. And then, turning around, he noticed that this sound was coming from the street. And then Steven burst into the room. Meanwhile, something was happening on the street, causing people to panic. As it turned out, a huge black monster with many eyes burst out from under the ground. The monster opened its round mouth, from which some liquid burst out, as well as a deafening scream. People ran away in panic through the streets. As it turned out, there was a dungeon breakthrough nearby. Eugene and Penelope ran outside and Steven told them to move away because it was dangerous. The man, saying that he would stop him, pulled his hand back, and a hexagon began to glow on his fist. Then he hit the ground with great force, causing a bright beam of light to shine. And then the asphalt in front of him formed a high wall that protected them. And then Steven shouted for them to take advantage of the chance and escape. Eugene, in a panic, thought about the fact that there was nothing like this in his memories. So why did a monster suddenly appear? While the boy was thinking about this, Steven crouched down on the ground, telling them to leave quickly. And then he pushed off the ground and flying over the wall, flew forward. He swung his leg sharply, pushing the monster's black tentacles away from the wall. And then, with a bright flash, he landed right on the monster, striking it. However, the monster only went limp under the man's feet, without receiving any damage. And then he began to hit the man. There was another explosion, and people screamed that the monster was already climbing over the wall. Penelope and her uncle also ran away. But then the girl stepped on her shoelace, and then she fell to the ground. And the monster immediately quickly launched its black tentacles towards her. But before they touched the girl, she collided with something. As it turned out, it was Eugene, who was holding a shield. Turning around, Eugene cried out that they had to run. And then they ran away together. Penelope looked at the guy's back with a confused face while he held her hand. They ran to the entrance of the shelter, which was in the shopping center. The guy told her to come in, to which Penelope asked him about him. Eugene replied that he needed to go back. He thought that he had seen such a monster before. They were weak alone, so they moved in a pack. And if they were not quickly gotten rid of, they would become a complete headache. Since Steven specializes in defense, he does not have a separate attack skill, and therefore he is at a clear disadvantage in a battle with such a monster. Eugene thought that he had to find a way to help Steven at all costs. But then Penelope grabbed his hand and cried out that she would go too. She told him to wake her up and then she could go fight. Eugene exclaimed that he would not do that because she had not yet signed the contract, and Penelope asked him if he was afraid that she would go back on her word. And then she cried out that she would not do that, and besides, the situation was critical. Eugene said that besides, she was still a child, and therefore he would not do it. He asked her if she really thought that once she woke up, she would start fighting. And then he said that he wanted to wake her up calmly and painlessly, and he was not going to throw her into battle right away. He couldn't stand to see a child fight alone, and he immediately thought of his brother. Turning around, he told Penelope that the adults would take care of everything, and that she had to get to the shelter safe and sound. And then he ran away, leaving the girl behind. Eugene ran quickly through the streets trying to figure out what to do. He told himself that he had been hanging around as a hunter for over 5 years now, so he had to force some kind of decision out of himself. He ran up to Steven, who was standing by the wall with a stick in his hands. The man asked the boy why he came since it was dangerous here, to which Eugene only shouted, telling him to use his defense skill. Steven responded by shouting that it was useless. Even with a protective barrier, it would not be possible to completely enclose the center. But the guy said that this skill was enough, and he had an idea. Soon they climbed the wall and watched the monster to see if it was below. Steven pulled his hand back and a bright magic circle glowed above his fist. He hit the wall with a sharp movement, causing a magic circle to spread across it. In response to these actions, the monster again opened its round mouth full of teeth and let out a nasty squeal. Meanwhile, stone walls began to appear around him, threatening to completely cover him. With a loud sound, these walls came together above the monster's head, producing a small explosion. Steven thought that he hadn't expected that this skill could be used in such a way. Meanwhile, small green magic circles appeared under Eugene's feet, and he pushed off from the wall, and then he jumped even higher with several high jumps. As he flew over the barrier, he thought that if he were to erect such a wall around the monster, it would become a huge cage in itself. And then he remembered that he had a suitable item that he had bought a little earlier. Namely, it was the A-grade deadly poison, the boundless black poison pill. Taking out one capsule, he thought that it was good that he had bought them after all. Pulling his hand back, he thought that if he detonated it inside the barrier, no one would get hurt. As he prepared to throw the pill, he looked inside and his eyes widened in surprise. As it turned out, these walls were empty. Eugene began to look around in confusion, while dark tentacles were emerging from the sewer. A couple of them rushed forward and wrapped themselves around the unsuspecting boy's leg. Grabbing the guy, the monster quickly burst out of the sewer, destroying the asphalt around itself and lifting the guy into the air. Flying in the air, Eugene thought about the fact that there was no sewerage in the dungeons, and therefore he could not even think about such a thing. Could this really be his end? But then someone hit the monster with a blue umbrella. As it turned out, it was Penelope who stole an umbrella from one of the cafes nearby. As the monster continued to hold Eugene in the air, Penelope continued to hit him with the umbrella, waving it around furiously, and the grip of the tentacles on the guy's leg weakened. Eugene landed skillfully on the ground, and the girl threw the umbrella on the ground and ran away, shouting at the guy to run towards the alley as well. And together they ran away from the monster. Eugene asked the girl what she, a civilian, was doing here, to which she asked him what he, an F-class, was doing here. The guy replied that at least he was awakened and an adult, to which the girl replied that he, who asked her for protection, was not allowed to say such things, and in the meantime the tentacles rushed forward after them. Eugene repeated as he ran that the girl was still little, to which she cried out that she knew it. And then she said that this is exactly why she needs even more power. She thought about how when Eugene saved her recently, she felt calm. She thought that he really wanted to protect her. And this made her angry because it meant that she did not have the strength to protect herself, which is why she had to rely on others. The girl cried out that she wanted to become stronger. She didn't want to rely on anyone anymore because she was small. Doesn't want to wait with a pounding heart for someone else's protection. She wants a power that she chooses for herself and with which she can protect herself. And then she said that he himself told her that she could become stronger. He himself told her that she had such powers, and she told him to then show her how strong she could become. And in the meantime, the monster's tentacles shot forward and began to tower over the boys. Eugene and Penelope stopped and looked up in panic. They grabbed each other's hands and everything around was filled with bright flashes of light. The flash of light became even brighter, hiding the boy and girl from view, and the monster struck with its tentacles. Steven ran out with a spear in his hands, asking how this happened. Meanwhile, Penelope flew above the ground and stopped the monster's tentacles, freezing them, causing a magic circle to glow above her fingers. There were reports that the cold skill Icy Breath had been activated. The registration of the awakened Penelope was being completed, and the girl exclaimed that she was an S-class. Steven stood there dumbfounded, looking at Eugene and Penelope. And the girl began to enthusiastically talk about her skills, but Eugene interrupted her, saying that they were not something to talk about in public like that. The monster's tentacles, buried under the rubble, cautiously emerged and looked around. And then they suddenly rose up behind Penelope. Eugene called out to the girl, noticing that the tentacles had approached her and were beginning to wrap around her arm. The girl screamed out of fear and waved her hand, hitting the monster against the wall, causing it to crumble into small pieces. Seeing the girl's strength, Steven and Eugene froze, and their faces darkened. The monster was pressed into the wall, in the depression made by Penelope's hand. The girl beamed and exclaimed that she would figure it out herself from now on. She approached Steven and asked him to put his weapon aside for her. And then she hit the ground with the end of the spear, causing the air around her to swirl and a bright flash to appear. Penelope pointed the spear forward, which now had a tip on it, which was made from her magical powers. Chunks of ice began to rain down around them, and Steven raised his hands, summoning shields to protect himself and Eugene. As Penelope rose above the ground, she used the skill Hermes Shoes, causing a magic circle to glow beneath her feet. And then, in a bright flash, she rushed forward with a spear. A second later, pieces of the monster's body and splashes of its blood flew in all directions. Stephen continued to protect Eugene with his shields, and he shouted at the girl to be careful if she didn't want to crush them to death. Hanging in the air, Penelope awkwardly scratched the back of her head and apologized, and she said that she was still not very good at controlling her power. Looking up, Eugene only laughed quietly and resignedly. He thought about how, as a hunter, she was called the Ice Witch. But in fact, she turned out to be a child who was capable of smiling so brightly. Eugene said that he didn't expect her to wake up so quickly. It would be ideal if she had an area attack skill. And then someone came up behind him and told him to leave it to him. A hand rose up, from which flashes of dark flame burst forth. And then everything around was illuminated by a bright flash that tore the monster into pieces. Penelope, who was still in the air, covered her face with her hands, shielding herself from the explosion that went off beneath her. And then she looked down in admiration, asking who did it. Oliver stood ahead, a little distance from his brother and Stephen, as trained monster parts and ashes fell to the ground. Everything around was in ruins. Stones from the destroyed wall of the building were lying on the ground, and somewhere a fire was still burning brightly. Coming closer, Eugene joyfully called out to his brother. But Oliver, turning around, showed his brother a very worried face. And then he ran up to him and started talking about how he was worried when they called him on the way, and how many times he had to be told not to wander around the streets. And in the meantime, Penelope came down to earth. In response to his brother's tirade, Eugene merely waved his hand and said that he need not worry anymore. Waving his hand, he pointed at Penelope and said that he had found himself a guard, the only one who had awakened from S-Class Penelope. The girl quietly greeted. Looking at Oliver, she thought that in front of her were indeed the eyes of the abyss. Eugene said that he decided to make a contract with her, and then he asked him if he had any complaints about the S-rank guards, to which Oliver asked about the girl's guardians, since she looks like a minor. Eugene hesitated to answer this question and looked away, and then he announced that he was going to become her guardian. This news did not particularly please Oliver. Penelope approached Stephen to return his spear and asked if a sponsor and a trustee were really so different. Stephen replied that a simple sponsor would not be able to take part in her affairs, so he would not be able to protect her even if an unfavorable contract were concluded. And then he said that the guardian is the legal guardian of the minor hunter, or more precisely, he acts as a parent. This information surprised the girl. She ran up to Eugene, asking if he would do this again, and Oliver immediately picked up, asking why his brother would care about a stranger, to which the guy replied that Penelope's uncle was worthless, and therefore he could not leave it like that. But it was up to the girl to decide. Hearing this, Oliver began to puff with anger, unable to utter a complete sentence. And then he grabbed his brother, taking him aside, and exclaimed that he could not allow this, even for the sake of his brother's safety. He said that there had already been more than 1 or 2 precedents of a high-level awakened using violence against his low-level guardian. And what S-class would timidly follow an F-class? Frowning, he pointed at the girl and asked if this child was attacking his brother. Penelope, taken aback by this, replied that she was not attacking, she was kind. Oliver only exclaimed angrily that he would rather become a trustee than his brother, to which the now irritated Penelope said that she didn't want that because Eugene had promised to do it. Oliver cried out, asking her what if everything suddenly changed later, to which the girl cried out that she would not do that because they had contact. And then she asked him if he was going to do that. Eugene tried to intervene in the conversation, but Oliver grabbed his brother and led him back, saying that they had nothing more to do here. But Penelope grabbed Eugene's arm, stopping him. However, she grabbed him too sharply, and therefore his humerus came out of its normal position, making a crunching sound. The boy leaned back slightly in pain, and his brother asked him if he was okay. Penelope also did not stand aside. Oliver asked his brother if he had seen the potion, or if he should call a doctor, to which Eugene only called his brother and pointed his finger at him. And then he asked him if that was really how he raised him. And then an irritated Eugene, pointing his finger at the guy's chest, shouted that choosing a guardian was Penelope's right, so why was he interfering? And moreover, he should be happy that he brought a new S-class to his guild. And then he waved his hand towards Stephen, asking why they should go home when things had not yet been put in order here, and he was still making Stephen wait. With a wave of his hand, he sent his brother to do his job as the head of the guild. Oliver nevertheless obeyed his brother and obediently walked away, and he, turning around, said that he would soon return. Eugene didn't respond to this but only sighed, placing his hands on his hips. Standing behind the boy, Penelope said that this head of the abyss was not at all like the one they had talked about so fervently. But in response to this, Eugene only exclaimed that it concerned her too, and then he told her not to come close and to sit there, and he pointed to the nearest stone with his finger. Penelope immediately asked about the condition of the guy's shoulder, to which he replied that it was just a slight dislocation, and that something else was more important now. Picking up a sneaker from the ground, he said that he would put it on her since she couldn't control her strength. He came closer and knelt down to put the shoes on the girl's feet, saying that they were such old things and that the size didn't fit. And then he said that tomorrow they would go get a new pair of sneakers. Penelope, smiling happily, said that it was awe-inspiring, to which the guy simply asked what kind of awe. The girl started to say that this usually happens in dramas, but then she noticed a fly flying towards Eugene's head, and she hit the guy on the head to kill the fly that was on her. The fly was successfully defeated by this blow, but the guy also got hit. His nose started bleeding and he jumped up, saying that he was not only trembling but that his heart was about to explode. To which the girl replied that she would be more careful. As he continued tying the laces on her sneakers, he said that she had recently asked him why he did so much. And then he said that he did it because her story didn't seem foreign to him, his own parents had passed away, and it was hard. He only has to think about how everything could have changed if they had had reliable support. And sadness takes hold of his soul. And then Eugene said that perhaps he didn't look so reliable. After a short silence, Penelope said that he was also quite reliable. The boy raised his head and asked again, to which Penelope, with her nose in the air, replied that it was true, insofar as it applied to a person who asked a high school student for protection. Holding out her fist to him, she said that he must now take good care of her as her guardian. Smiling, he also extended his fist and said that he asked her to take care of him too. And then they lightly bumped fists. Then Eugene said that he wanted to say something, even if it didn't compare to her parents' love. And then he told her those cherished words, "I love you." Hearing this, Penelope laughed, asking what this was for now, and a message appeared stating that the awakened S-class Penelope had received the positive effect of the code word. However, Penelope's uncle came running, calling her loudly. He ran closer, exclaiming that he was so scared for her. And then, with a grin, he asked if it was true that she had awakened. And then he said that they say that the awakened ones make a lot of money, and it turns out that there is still one problem left. Coming closer, the man said that he was so worried when he lost her. And then he asked her again if it was true that she had awakened. Sighing, the girl replied that everything was so, she was an S-class. In response to this, the uncle exclaimed, "Then now they will have a mountain of money." But then the girl, turning to Eugene, said that she was leaving home. She had a contract with this guy. The irritated man asked her where she, a 16-year-old, was going. Eugene corrected him, saying that she was 15, and then he said that by special law a hunter could become independent at 14. But the man was not convinced and he shouted, telling them to stop talking nonsense. But then Eugene held his phone out in front of him. A recording of their recent conversation in the restaurant began to play from the phone's speakers. Eugene said he would also get hold of the CCTV footage, and then he said that it had become clear long ago that the man was a bad guardian. And recently, he had abandoned the child altogether, running away, the man screamed, trying to object. They continued to argue, to which Penelope only looked away. Eugene said that he had had enough and that he would not dare to approach Penelope again. But then, with loud cries that everything had been planned from the very beginning, he grabbed Eugene by the collar. The enraged man shouted that he would sue him and he would be punished. But then Penelope raised her hands with an umbrella, and then she slammed it down on the ground, right between the two men. Eugene said quietly that the awakened ones must not harm ordinary people. And the next moment, a joyful expression lit up the girl's face. And then the girl asked her uncle what she should do if he started to get physical. The man tried to object, saying that he also saw that she had hit him like that on purpose, but then the girl's hands began to break the umbrella. Noticing this, the man's face distorted into an expression of fear, and he made a strangled sound. Penelope smiled brightly and asked him why he had said that. And then she said that then the uncle pushed the guy, and then he fell, and she began to approach him threateningly. In a panic, the man wondered if this was really the same high school student he saw at home every day. Looking at the girl who was grinding her umbrella into dust, he thought that he was standing in front of a predator. Eugene, who activated the resistance immediately, thought that this aura definitely belonged to the S-class. Penelope, taking a few steps forward, told her uncle that he himself must know that he was not in a position for her to be grateful to him. Her hands continued to crumple the umbrella, forming it into a tight ball. Throwing this lump on the ground, where the frightened man was already sitting, she said that her guardian had not even bought her a pathetic umbrella. The man glanced sideways at the lump that had rolled up to him, and Penelope said that if it were up to her, he would already be the same lump. And then she touched his shoulder, which made the man let out another frightened cry. And she said that now she would close her eyes to this. Leaning closer, she said that she would turn a blind eye to it because he was worthless and not worth an ounce of her attention. She told him to remember this and go on with his worthless life. And if he doesn't follow her advice and continues to cling to her or quarrel with her guardian, attracting attention to himself, then she will find him. And the girl exclaimed that then she certainly would not turn a blind eye to all this. Sitting on the ground, Penelope's uncle was in shock. Penelope happily ran up to Eugene and asked him how she had done, to which the boy thought that a bad example was contagious. Be that as it may, this is how Penelope became a member of the Abyss, and Eugene was now freed from captivity. Suddenly, a loud sound was heard in the apartment where Eugene was sleeping, causing the guy to wake up. As it turned out, it was Oliver who burst into his brother's room, and Eugene asked him what was going on. Instead of answering, Oliver quickly began to approach his brother's bed, and he only continued to ask him questions. Then Oliver extended his hand and told him to give him what he had bought yesterday. Hearing this, Eugene asked in a panic whether he had spent too much money then, and he thought that it was possible to spend everything. But Oliver only said that it was not about this, but about the limitless pill of dark poison. Eugene held out his hand, which held the pill, and Oliver immediately took it. The guy asked his brother how he even knew that he hadn't bought it and why he needed it. Oliver asked his brother if he really didn't trust him that much, and he looked like he was ready to cry. Before Eugene could ask the guy what he was talking about, he rushed forward to hug him. Oliver leaned against his brother's shoulder and asked him if he had bought the pill so that he could poison himself if necessary, so as not to become his weak spot, so that they could not take him hostage. Eugene, in a panic, thought that everything was completely wrong. Oliver pulled away from his brother and told him not to use the pill, even if he was so worried about him. And he said with a smile that even if something like that happened, he would definitely come to save him. Eugene thought about the fact that he bought it to use when clearing the dungeon alone in secret from him. But now, he can't say that he has resistance to poisons. After some time, they left the apartment and entered the elevator. Eugene asked if everything had been resolved with Penelope, to which his brother replied that his people had come to her house yesterday. They checked this uncle's copy of the registration, and apparently he had embezzled and spent billions of Penelope's inheritance on his own business. In exchange for them not going to court, he wrote a receipt that he would not come near the girl again, so he would not interfere anymore because the issues were successfully settled and everything was secured with a small amount of money. Eugene asked if the girl had really agreed not to sue, to which Oliver replied that it was true. She said that she simply did not want to deal with him anymore. Eugene said that now that amount would seem rather ridiculous. And Oliver said that the girl had also slowly finished adapting to the abilities, and it looks like she spent all of last night in the training room. The guy, entering inside, said that the room can withstand even S-class power, so she can use it to her heart's content, but inside they found complete devastation. Part of the ceiling fell to the floor with a loud crash. Eugene asked his brother if he was the one who said that this hall could withstand the power of an S-class. Meanwhile, Penelope was under the ceiling, turning over in the air. They landed on the floor with a sharp movement, and then her icy energy rushed towards the punching bag. Penelope rushed towards her and hit her, causing chunks of ice to fly off in all directions, and the girl quietly said the name of the skill, Shadowless Day, and from under her foot a multitude of shadows spread out in all directions. Looking around, Eugene asked if something had happened to Penelope, but then suddenly he felt something strange. The boy looked down at the shadow that was touching his leg and noticed that he couldn't move. Penelope, not paying attention to anything, began to activate the skill, and black shadows crawled forward over the stones on the floor and over the bars. The shadows also crawled over Eugene, causing him to scream in fear. But Penelope continued and she raised her leg up. Then she kicked the floor with all her might, causing a flash of light to shoot up into the air. And then the girl, breaking the floor with her feet, ran forward. She jumped up and pulled her hand back to strike, and then her fist hit the floor, causing it to become even more cracked. The impact was so strong that even the walls of the hall could not withstand it and were covered with cracks. And in the middle of all this chaos stood a girl, with pieces of the floor swirling around her. But then she heard someone scream behind her. Turning around, she noticed that Eugene and his brother had been there all this time. A weakened Eugene fell to the floor and said that the girl had become stronger. The girl became worried about her guardian and came closer, and Eugene had already come to his senses. Looking forward, he noticed the girl who was worried about his condition. Her hair was cut short. Eugene didn't immediately recognize Penelope, and so he asked her who she was, to to which she exclaimed that it was her, and had he really lost his memory, and the guy replied that she had changed beyond recognition. And then Oliver said that a stylist had worked on her. Smiling, Penelope said that in the abyss they had adjusted her image and told her that she would soon be joining the Hunters Association. And she said that it was necessary because she would soon be on air, so she needed to keep an eye on the picture. The girl said that she had already prepared the documents for registration that would need to be provided, and she was constantly adding something to them, while simultaneously sorting out the skills. And then she awkwardly noted that she hadn't noticed him enter, to which Eugene, who had already gotten to his feet, asked her what those skills were. The girl replied that the first was Cold Breath, a freezing skill that he had already seen. The other is the Hermes Shoes, which allows one to hover and instantly move short distances. And Shadowless Day places a special buff on a large area. When used, the effectiveness of skills and attributes increases greatly, and it can also slow down the opponent by absorbing his shadow. Eugene asked the girl if this meant that she was becoming stronger by absorbing power from the environment, and then said that this was why the training hall had turned into ruins. But then Penelope said that there is another skill, and it is Body Whiteness, which allows you to read information from a corpse. Eugene remarked that it was quite creepy, and the girl said in disappointment that it should have been an attack skill. While filling out the paperwork, Eugene said that they would hide the Body Whiteness for now, since it was not necessary to reveal all the skills when registering. And then he started talking about what else should have been hidden about the girl's skills. Hearing this, Penelope looked away, blushing a little. And then she approached the guy and said that he understood it so well, to which he replied that it was all nonsense and asked her if she had figured out how to control the force. But then Oliver stepped between his brother and the girl, saying that his brother was so knowledgeable because he had gone into all the details for him. And then he told the girl to keep her distance. And they started arguing again. Penelope asked him why he was interfering again, to which he only replied that he was only helping with explanations. Eugene scratched his face awkwardly, wondering if this could be allowed to happen. After some time, a large crowd of reporters and journalists gathered in front of the Hunters registration building. Penelope stepped out of the car and all attention immediately turned to her. Meanwhile, two people stood behind the pillar, watching all this. As it turned out, it was Eugene who said that his Penelope was doing so well. Steven said that instead of acting like that, he should have gone with her, since Penelope was upset that he didn't go with her. To which Eugene replied that he had a lot of bad memories of crowded places. Taking off the mask from his face, he said that even resentment has its end. And then he said that now that the girl was destined for wealth and fame, he would probably fade into the background. And the man just looked at the guy without saying anything. Eugene was glad that Penelope was okay, but the differences were too big, and there was no trace left of that cold and arrogant ice witch from the future. Now, in her place, there is a high school student hunter with a confident smile. And the dungeon breakthrough that happened a few days ago didn't happen initially either. And Eugene wondered if everything would be okay if the future was changing so much. The guy shook his head and thought that it didn't matter. Everything was fine. That it was fine. He peered out from behind the pole, thinking that now he needed to look around to find promising newcomers. The guy began to scan the crowd with his skill, but only low classes caught his eye. Eugene thought that it was unlikely that he would find another S-class so easily. But suddenly, noticing something, Eugene jumped up and ran somewhere. The guy thought that nothing was impossible, because it all started with him going back in time to save his brother. Noticing some guy in the crowd, Eugene thought that since he was able to change everything for the better for Oliver and Penelope, then perhaps this is exactly what his skill was given for. And, running up to the guy, he grabbed him by the wrist. Eugene thought that it was precisely in order to make another unlimited diamond shine that his skill was given to him. The awakened Magnus turned around and asked the guy who he was. He was an F-class and had no potential to awaken, but he had access to the initial skill to learn the SS class. Eugene began to greet the guy, feigning joy, saying that they hadn't seen each other for so long and couldn't he remember him. Scratching his neck awkwardly, Magnus said that he really didn't remember him. Smiling, Eugene replied that everything was fine, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and he himself was thinking that he didn't even know him. And then he opened his eyes again, using the skill, and he immediately noticed the guy's SS-class skill, Golden Forge Master. From the name alone, it is clear that this is a special skill related to the production of equipment, and also an SS class. And even after 5 years, no such awakenings were found. Eugene thought that if he could acquire this skill, he could build himself a bed out of bags of money from all over the world. And all this through this man who looks like a weakling, depressed by life's difficulties. Eugene came closer, asking if he had awakened too. And Magnus said that he had, although he was an F-class, They gave a $1,000,001 subsidy for registration. Eugene said that he also awakened as an F class, and he asked him if he would go with him to receive basic training. Magnus sighed and replied that he only came for the money. Basic training had to be paid for, and no one wanted F class with him. And then Eugene grabbed the guy by the hands. And then with a beaming smile, he said that he could get it with him in his guild. Eugene started to say that he could organize everything for free, but then Steven pulled him back, saying that only members of the guild could receive training for newbies. They began to argue, and then Magnus noticed that it was Steven from the Abyss. And then he asked Eugene in an uncertain voice if they really knew each other and how it happened. In response to this, Eugene beamed and said that the head of the Abyss was actually his younger brother. Magnus turned away, noticing that the guy suddenly began to blind him, to which he replied that it was all an aura of power. And then he said that he would put in a good word for him, so they should go study together, and he would even lend him his equipment. Magnus said that he couldn't even remember him, because he could accept something like that. And Eugene took his hand again. And he told the guy not to worry about it, just to agree. And he wants to take care of him because Magnus is a good man. Smiling, Eugene said that he really deserved to be treated like that. Looking at the boy's face, Magnus hesitantly repeated the words that he really deserved this. And then his eyes filled with tears. Falling to the ground, Magnus burst into tears, sobbing loudly. And Eugene immediately asked what was wrong. After some time, hot tea poured from the machine into the glass. Eugene handed the glass to Magnus, saying that it would be better to order some expensive coffee, to which Magnus replied that this was enough for him. Eugene asked the guy if he had calmed down, to which he said with a weak smile on his face that he had calmed down. Wiping away the remaining tears, he apologized and said that it had been too long since he had heard such words. And Eugene noticed that it seemed like it was hard for him. Magnus said that as a child he had a talent for working with his hands, and even won many prizes. But as an adult, this was of no use. Everyone just kept telling me to stop messing around and get down to studying. And then he hit rock bottom. Because he was a complete zero in his studies, his grades at university were terrible, he couldn't find a job, and there were also family circumstances. At some point, he found himself in such a deplorable state and with a lot of debts. He quietly said that he had become an outsider with nowhere to go. After a short silence, Eugene said that he understood him perfectly, and he thought that even after the world changed, everything remained the same. People are literally divided into classes. Only combat and healing skills are welcome. If you are none of these, you are F class among both hunters and the rest of society. What could have happened to Magnus under the original scenario? Eugene squeezed his knee and thought that everything was different now, because now he was going to change everything. And then he jumped up from the bench and shouted that it was time for them to act. And then he told Magnus with a smile that they didn't need to be discouraged, because they lived in a world where it was hard to survive alone. Pointing somewhere into the sky, Eugene took the boy by the shoulder and told him to raise his head with confidence. Otherwise, he would remain depressed and would have to spend money on spinal treatment. And then he raised his hands and cried out that he loves himself, he is great, and others simply do not understand. And then he turned around to tell Magnus that they needed to think like this. And then he told the guy that he loved him too. Magnus looked at Eugene, his cheeks slightly flushed. A message appeared that the awakened Magnus received a beneficial effect from the code word. Eugene thought everything would go well. But Spencer, the head of the Abyss's Human Resources Department, said it couldn't. Eugene, hearing this, made a disappointed, strangled sound. And then he said that they only had to give in once. Spencer folded his hands in front of him and said that giving in and sending the man to training was the same as vouching for him. Rumors will spread that such a privilege is given to anyone and everyone. These words hurt Magnus. Eugene picked up the weakened guy and irritably shouted that it was wrong to say that. To which the man replied that they could say that somewhere, that's all he meant. Eugene began to beg again, saying that Magnus was a good man. Taking off his glasses, the man said that he knew that he had remarkable insight, and that finding Penelope was already an achievement. However, it could all just be a coincidence, and Spencer adjusted his glasses, showing his middle finger. And then he said that he didn't understand his intentions, especially considering that he had recently almost fallen for a broker's scam, and had persuaded their boss to take up farming. Magnus thought about Eugene being scolded because of him, which reminded him of a scene from the TV series. And then the guy, covering his face with his hands, ran away. Walking outside with Magnus, Eugene clutched his head and said that this man was getting tougher and tougher. And then he said that he would now ask his younger brother directly, to which Magnus, shaking his head, said that it was not necessary. Smiling, he said that he had already told him that he was valuable, and that was enough for him. And thanks to him, he felt the will to live a little longer. He said that he would not be discouraged and would do what he could, and he had even already found jobs for F-grade students like him. And then a black car started driving up to them. Magnus and Eugene approached the car. A moment later, someone's strong hand opened the car door, calling Magnus. There were some bandits inside, and one of them said that it was time for the guy to pay back his debt. And Magnus, smiling, told Eugene that he would contact him again. Eugene thought that all this looked wildly dangerous. Another man asked Magnus if he had received the subsidy, and he began rummaging through his bag. Saying that this was still not enough, the man jerked the money away. Eugene decided to intervene and asked the men who they were and why they were taking Magnus away. The men's faces twisted into angry expressions as they asked him what he would do if he found out. Frightened, Eugene replied that he wanted to go too, and the car quickly drove along the city roads. Eugene and Magnus found themselves pinned together in the car by the bandits' bodies. Eugene whispered to Magnus that he had taken money from terrible people, to which he replied that the bank had not given him a loan, and more importantly, why had he followed him? Eugene replied that he couldn't just let him go alone. The man sitting next to him asked Eugene if they knew the other and if he was awakened, to which he panicked and replied that he was an F-class. Magnus wanted to say that Eugene was from the abyss, but the guy covered his mouth with his hand and said that they were childhood friends, and the guy told him that there was work for people like them, so he became interested. The man only grinned in response and said that everything worked out well, and then he asked if they wanted to go with them to the dungeon to get magic stones, because F-classes aren't even taught, and they take everyone. Eugene feigned surprise and turned around, asking again. Another man said that Eugene would get special treatment because he was Magnus's friend, and the boy happily agreed. And then everyone in the car laughed happily when Eugene said that he mistook such good guys for bad guys. He said that thanks to them he got this job, and he himself thought about how he himself had once fallen for something like this, fallen for an unequal contract where 70–80% was taken as security. And if you're unlucky, you might end up wounded or even killed by the monster. Eugene thought that Magnus must have died without having time to reveal his potential. The driver of the car told the boys that they would only need to collect everything that seemed valuable. Eugene exclaimed that this was a real jackpot since you can collect whatever you want, but he himself thought that this was a complete scam. While they were driving across the bridge, Eugene asked them where their office was, to which they replied that it was in Myeongmokdong, to which the guy replied that it wasn't that far. Finally, after some time, they arrived at some building. Upon reading the name Hope Mission Center, Eugene exclaimed that it was a good name, while Magnus clung to his shoulders in fear. Opening the door, the man invited the guys to come in. As he walked up the stairs, Eugene said happily that although the building was old, he already felt a future full of hope. Looking around, he noticed that their office was well lit. But suddenly one of the men struck the guy in the back from behind. The blow immediately sent Eugene falling onto the dirty, tiled floor. As it turned out, they pushed him into a room where several people were already sitting, and they immediately paid attention to the guy. Eugene tried to continue pretending, and then asked with a smile who it was that hit him like that. But the next moment, the men started kicking Magnus, who was already lying on the floor. The guy immediately exclaimed, asking what they had suddenly started, and then one of the men grabbed him by the shoulder and said that they had dragged him here without any debts, and he better regret that he came here voluntarily. And then another man continued, saying that you can enter here of your own free will, but you can't leave. The men stopped beating Magnus, and he crawled up to Eugene and apologized. Bursting into tears, he said that he had to go through this alone, but now he was getting into trouble because of it, even though he was clean of debt. Eugene responded by quietly calling the guy's name, but then he was grabbed by the shoulder. A strong hand lifted him from the floor and sat him down on the sofa, and the man said that it was high time to sign the contract. And then they shoved the contract in his face and ordered him to put his fingerprint on it. The man, who was apparently in charge, said that after deducting the commission, his profit would be 20%, and since he had no debts, he would make a lot of money. He said that this contract was specially created by the awakened. Breaking it blatantly would inflict a D-class curse, so he couldn't even think of escaping after breaking it. Meanwhile, Magnus continued to burst into tears when the men took his hand and already put the seal. Eugene said he had one request, to which the chief replied that even if he started begging, it wouldn't work. After a slight hesitation, Eugene asked if he could compare the contracts. And then he said that it would be a shame if he had the same conditions as Magnus, since he had no debts. And then the men laughed heartily, exclaiming that they had come across a meticulous fellow. The chief said that it was right, because one must live thinking first of oneself, and he handed Magnus's contract to Eugene. Taking the slightly glowing contract into his hands, Eugene began to examine it carefully. He noted that Magnus would indeed not be able to receive more than 10%, to which the man replied that the other 10% would go towards paying off his debt. And then, Eugene said that this was indeed a natural slave contract. After asking if they dared to keep Magnus as a laborer, Eugene easily tore the piece of paper in half. The men were somewhat taken aback by how easily the guy tore up the contract. A message has appeared stating that due to the contract being terminated, a D-class debuff curse will be activated. Eugene leaned on the back of the sofa to stand up, as a message immediately appeared stating that the debuff curse had been removed by curse resistance. Then Eugene swung his legs sharply, kicking the lead bandit in the face. The men called their leader with concern. Eugene grabbed the man by the hair, and he exclaimed that this bastard was not an F-class. But before he could say anything else, Eugene slammed his face into the table. The blow caused cracks to appear on the table, and the man lost consciousness. Eugene said that he was actually an F-class, but with better equipment. The other men grabbed whatever they could to attack the boy. They cried out in fury that today the man would die here and now. But Eugene pulled out his phone, and the men said it was too late to call the police. But it turned out that Eugene had not called the police, but his brother's assistant, Steven. And at that very second, the man burst inside, pushing open the locked iron doors with his bare hands. The bandits clearly didn't expect anyone else to come here. And before they had time to react, Steven had already raised his hand to strike. One of the bandits began to defend himself with an iron stick, shouting that it turned out that Eugene had accomplices. And then Steven's big fist landed square on the man's chest, knocking his glasses off his face and causing his mouth to open wide. The blow was so strong that the man's body flew to the side like a rag doll. And then, amid the anxious cries of the other bandits, the man's body fell heavily to the floor. Turning around, Steven told Eugene that he had come to pick him up. And then he began to strike at the rest of the bandits while Eugene approached Magnus. Eugene explained that all this time he had been diligently distracting the men's attention. But in fact, from the moment they got into the car, he secretly pressed the call button. This was enough for Steven to understand the situation, and he was also able to describe in detail where they were, so it was easy for him to find them. Meanwhile, Steven, pulling his hand back, hit the man in the face who wanted to attack him from behind. And then he struck another man who was running up from the side. The bandit fell to the floor next to his comrade, who was lying unconscious and rubbing the bruised area. But suddenly the man pulled a knife from the hem of his pants, and then he jumped up to stab Steven, screaming that he would kill him if he didn't stop. Noticing this, Magnus decided to call out to Steven to warn him. However, it was too late, and the man's knife had already reached Steven's chest. But then beads of cold sweat ran down the bandit's face as he began to look at the man's chest in panic. As it turned out, the knife only cut the fabric of the shirt, but did not touch the body at all. Holding his hand out in front of his head, folded to make a snap, Steven replied that he should have chosen a weapon worthy of A-class. And then, with a sharp movement of his finger, he sent the man flying, causing him to bend almost in half. Having lost his balance, the bandit began to fall to the floor. His comrade immediately ran up to him, and the other suddenly recognized Steven. The bandit noticed that Steven from the abyss was standing in front of them, and Steven himself, sighing, looked at his ruined shirt. The man turned his menacing gaze to the bandits and ordered them to kneel. And after a few seconds, all the bandits gathered in one place and silently stood on their knees. Steven asked Magnus if he was wounded. Looking back, the man asked Eugene, who was sorting through some papers, what to do with them. To which the guy replied that he needed to think about it, because an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then the guy pulled out a contract from somewhere that glowed with a golden light. Dropping to the floor, Eugene handed the contract to the bandit leader and told him to sign the S-class contract. The man took the contract and began to examine it, and then he shouted that a 10% profit and a 50-year contract was a complete scam. Eugene simply responded to this by saying that this is a super part-time job, where it is enough to simply collect everything that can bring in money. There was a murmur of cries among the other bandits, and the leader said that it was the same as if he had sent them to their deaths. The man wanted to say something else, but then another paper flew into his face. As it turned out, Eugene began to scatter some contacts around the man. The leader took the piece of paper in confusion, and Eugene said that he found it in the drawer. He said that all these are contracts of F ranks they brought, and there are more than 30 of them. Eugene asked how many of them were left unharmed, to which the man said it didn't matter, since they had volunteered, and a good half of them were already dead. But before he could finish his sentence, Eugene kicked him in the face. The man sank to the floor miserably, clutching his cheek, and Eugene called him trash. And then he asked him whether he really thought that since these people were F-classes, it didn't matter even if they died. If you push them with promises to take them to the dungeon, many will agree. And then it's enough to push them there like some kind of cheap, consumable. Eugene exclaimed that it didn't matter what level these people were. The main thing was that they were people, and they were just fucking murderers. Magnus quietly called out to Eugene. Eugene told the bandits that they should crawl as they had been crawling until now. Then they would understand what they had done. Turning away, Eugene said that he wanted to immediately throw them into a high-level dungeon, but suddenly, one of them called out to him. Breaking out in a cold sweat, the man exclaimed that he was guilty, they were guilty. Let him give them time to think, let him have mercy. And then he quietly said that a contract for them was too much. In response to this, Eugene only smiled brightly and said that it was well done. Placing his hand on the man's head, the boy said it was commendable that they wanted to think things through properly. Going lower, he said that then they must pay the appropriate price for the advice of the crime. Soon, Eugene, Magnus, and Stephen came out of the building and got into the car. Stephen began to report that they had already delivered the scammers to the Hunters Association, handed them over to the worker, paid compensation to the victims, and he would provide a report later, while Eugene leaned tiredly against Magnus. Magnus suddenly thanked the guy, to which the guy asked him what he was thanking him for. Shaking his head, Eugene said that today was all a small thing, but then Magnus said that he couldn't help but worry. Eugene thought that later, with the awakening of his skill, he would receive a good benefit. A tear fell onto Magnus's hand as he said that Eugene had already saved him twice. Eugene began to calm the boy down again as he asked what would have happened to him if it weren't for him. And then he rushed to hug Eugene, thanking him and telling him that he was his hero. The car moved forward while Eugene tried to get rid of Magnus, while Stephen calmly told them to buckle up. After returning, Eugene immediately went to Spencer. After he laid out the whole story to him, he, as Penelope's guardian, was able to get himself a room in the dorm. Magnus and Eugene entered the room, which seemed to be sparkling all over. Magnus exclaimed that this room of the train was a luxury apartment. Eugene, looking at some paper, said that it was written here that there were 4 rooms. Magnus continued to marvel at the fact that one could live in such a place while studying. And then Eugene asked him if he knew how to do housework, to which the guy replied that he knew how to cook ramen. Eugene said that outsiders were not allowed into the dormitory, but workers were allowed to live in the house, so he could pretend to be a worker to stay here. The guy immediately said that this did not mean that he would have to do the housework for real. But instead of getting angry, Magnus, as usual, burst into tears. He rushed to hug the guy again, saying that he was such a good friend, and Eugene again tried to avoid it. After a while, Magnus was already sleeping peacefully in bed. Looking at him through the half-open door, Eugene thought that he had fallen asleep quickly, apparently exhausted. Magnus began to chatter in his sleep, offering to cook Eugene food or a bath or himself. Eugene began to leave the room, saying that he needed to quickly move his things from Oliver's room. But then he met Stephen in the passage, which made him cry out in fear. In a panic, Eugene asked the man if Oliver had sent him again to lock him up. The man replied that this time he came for a different reason. He said it was a difficult matter, so he needed him to follow him, which didn't reassure Eugene at all. After some time, they reached a restaurant where music and conversations of numerous visitors could be heard. The waiter, noticing the new guests, quickly turned around to ask them how many people they needed the table for. But he immediately cried out in fear, noticing a huge man, Stephen, in front of him, and Eugene walking behind him. Taking off his sunglasses, Stephen asked the waiter if he knew Alex. The waiter immediately bowed low, saying that he had received a call, and then offered to take them somewhere quieter. Visitors began to whisper that the man had apparently come to collect money. A few minutes later, the most popular items on the menu appeared on the table. There were also several bottles of alcohol on the table. The waiter bowed low and exclaimed that they could call him if they needed anything else. Looking around, Eugene wondered why Stephen had brought him here because it looked youthful. Stephen said that the place was recommended to him by the void hunter Alex, who was about the same age as Eugene, and said that the place was popular. Stephen stared at Eugene and told him to relax and have a comfortable time. However, Eugene couldn't do this even if he wanted to. Having started to open a bottle of alcohol, the guy asked why they had come here. But then Stephen took the bottle from the guy's hands, saying that he would pour it himself. Stephen began pouring alcohol into Eugene's glass, holding the bottle in both hands as a sign of respect. And he said he wanted to apologize before it was too late. The man said that all this time, he disliked him. He seemed to him a useless obstacle that only hindered the future head of the guild. Eugene thought irritably that first the man decided to apologize, and then insult. But then, Stephen said he was wrong. Smiling at Eugene, the man said that he turned out to be a good person. This did not make any impression on Eugene, but only puzzled him even more. Stephen continued that he realized this from when he came to help him when the monster broke through. He realized this when he gained Penelope's trust and entered into a contract with her, resolving the custody issues that could have become a source of trouble. And today he also went to save his friend, risking his own safety. Steven said that now he understood that he could be trusted to cover the rear. But Eugene thought that all this was a misunderstanding. But then he came to his senses and thought that this was a chance. This is a great chance to strengthen your relationship and use a safe word. And then Eugene, with a joyful smile, clinked glasses of alcohol with the man, thinking that today he would definitely make him his protege. Steven said the guy had handled things very well today, and he asked him if he had had some kind of secret plan for the awakening brokers a few days earlier. Eugene didn't hesitate and replied that that was indeed the case. He was investigating something. Steven, putting food on his plate, said that this task was still too risky for F class, to which Eugene replied that he went there assuming that Oliver would not leave it so easily. The guy said that his brother ended up grabbing him before there was any thought. His brother cared about him so much. To which Steven said that it was natural, since he was his only relative. And then he said that he understood him perfectly, because he himself was in a similar situation. He then went on to explain that he too had grown up without parents, being raised by his grandparents, to which Eugene let out a sympathetic sigh. The man continued by saying that when he grew up, he would come to them every vacation to check on their well-being, and it was during the monster's advance that he awoke, while protecting his remaining family. Steven said his grandparents died last year from illness, and the chief had been a great help to him since then, even hiring a foreign doctor who specialized in caring for the sick. Smiling, Steven said that Oliver understood the value of family ties. Pouring another drink into Eugene's glass, the man told him to be understanding of his brother's concerns, to which Eugene replied that he would do so, and that it made him feel better to know that someone who understood his brother was his right hand. After clinking glasses again, the guy said that he would simply take care of him in the future. After a while, Steven noticed that Eugene was a little more resistant to alcohol than he looked. Eugene replied that he had not yet drunk much, and besides, he had an embarrassing habit that appeared when he was drunk, and he thought that he would immediately prepare the conditions for himself to pronounce the code word, blaming it on the delirium of a drunk. But then, Steven noticed that the guy had already drunk quite a bit, and Eugene looked in surprise at the many empty bottles on the table, and this left the guy perplexed. He thought about how he couldn't seem to get drunk because of his poison resistance skill. He clutched his head in desperation, thinking that he didn't want to say the code word sober, and Steven asked what was wrong with him. Smiling again, Eugene replied, rising from under the table, that he was simply lost in thought. Meanwhile, he was trying to turn off his poison resistance skill, and the next second, having submitted to the pleas, the skill finally turned off. And then Eugene's glass, still filled with alcohol, flew down. The boy's face turned deeply red, and Steven asked if he was okay. Eugene looked up reluctantly, his words coming out with difficulty. His gaze fell on him as he quietly muttered that everything went to his head at once, and then his head hit the table with a dull thud. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly through the windows of the dorm room. Eugene, who was lying on the bed, suddenly woke up. He stood up and grabbed his head, which was sore from a hangover. He muttered quietly that he didn't think the skill would just shut down. But then someone put a basin of water in front of him and said that he had brought water for washing. Eugene's face immediately froze. Looking in the direction the voice came from, Eugene saw Steven standing in front of him. The guy jumped up on the bed, pushing the blanket away, and Steven just calmly said that if he wanted to start training today, then he needed to get ready already. Eugene's head was immediately filled with various questions, such as why Steven was here now. Looking at the status window, he saw that he was still able to make him his protege. Noticing the guy's confusion, the man asked him if he really didn't remember what happened last night. And then he thoughtfully noted that the guy seemed to have a hangover, and therefore, he needed to check if everything was okay. Eugene started screaming that he didn't want anything like that, but suddenly a straw and juice were shoved into his mouth. Still not understanding anything, the guy started drinking the juice, and Steven said that it was Puraria juice. It helps with hangovers. And then he put his hands on the guy's legs, saying that if he pressed on this point, everything would quickly pass. Steven offered Eugene a gold pot in case he couldn't get to the toilet. But Eugene, having come to his senses a little, waved him off and asked why he was behaving like that. In response to this, the man said that the guy really didn't remember anything. And then he began to talk about what happened last night. Deciding that Eugene had had too much to drink, Steven immediately ran to him to get him up from his seat. But then the guy grabbed him by the wrist. Steven, not understanding, called out to the guy, and he only addressed him politely. Eugene said that he had something important to tell him, so he should listen carefully. And then the guy with a burning gaze said the three cherished words, "I love you." Eugene began to ruffle his hair, saying that it was unfortunate that he was in this state, and that he himself did not want to do this in this state. And then he asked the man if he said that he loved him, to which Stephen replied that he did. Stephen stood there dumbfounded as Eugene staggered up from the table, saying that he should have told him he loved him. Stephen told Eugene that he had confessed his love to him like that about 30 more times, and Eugene immediately fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness. Smiling, the man said that everything was fine. He even liked it. Stephen began to recount the events of the previous night again, when, after this confession, he lifted the guy off the couch while he continued to confess. The man chuckled and asked if this was the embarrassing drinking habit he had spoken of. Closing his eyes, Eugene asked the man not to laugh because he was asking to be heard. And then he confessed his love to him again, to which Stephen only smiled. And the man remembered another person who had told him the same words. He remembered how one day, while carrying his grandfather, who was already drunk, young Stephen asked him why he needed to get so drunk. To which the grandfather replied that he could afford it because he had such a reliable grandson. Turning around, Grandpa smiled and told Stephen to never dwell on the words of some strangers who said that his parents abandoned him or something. After patting him on the head, he said that he was the best grandson for his grandfather. Stephen said that he had started to get rowdy again when drunk, but he still smiled. And so Stephen continued to carry his business back, while he confessed his love to him over and over again. Stephen told Eugene that for some reason when he looked at him, he remembered his grandfather. Eugene looked up in confusion and asked again. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Stephen replied that it was all true. Then the guy wondered if he really looked that old at 20, and shaking his head, Stephen replied that he himself thought it was strange. Smiling, he said that, of course, the guy was no grandfather, but still, he said that he had not felt such peace for a long time, as if he were next to his grandfather. Apparently, that's why he was constantly trying to give her something. And after that, the man promised that he wouldn't talk nonsense in front of others. And then he extended his hand to Eugene, asking him if he could then drop in sometimes to inquire about his well-being and visit him. Stephen said he wanted to make up for any remaining regrets he had with the man who raised him. Hearing this, Eugene wondered if this was the ideal teacher effect. Words of love awaken memories not of a friend or lover, but of the person who raised him, and impose on him the projection of this educator. In that case, Penelope and Magnus's good nature is understandable because they see Eugene as their tutor, just like ducklings. And with Oliver, everything was more impulsive because he was his tutor from the very beginning. Soon, Eugene walked Stephen out, saying an awkward goodbye, and then he noticed Magnus standing behind the wall, shaking. Eugene went to the bathroom and Magnus clung to him, saying that he was so scared when Stephen showed up there so suddenly. Penelope burst in immediately, exclaiming that she had heard that Eugene had moved into the dorm and into the room next to hers. As it turned out, the door couldn't withstand the girl's blow, and now you were a huge hole, and Eugene said that she could knock at least sometimes. Penelope immediately ran up to Eugene to tear Magnus away from him and asked what it was, to which the boy calmly replied that he was his friend. And the guy thought that this was a brainwashing skill that even S-classes were willing to follow him, and not education. Wasn't it too dangerous? And later the guy found out that he could turn on poison resistance again. A few days later, there was a variety of dishes on the table, and Eugene praised Magnus, saying that he had quickly gotten the hang of it. The guy said that he didn't have to try so hard every time, to which Magnus replied that he couldn't do that because he didn't even pay rent. And Penelope immediately said that he was right and could live like that. After taking a bite, Penelope said that the guy should at least cook if he wants to repay the debt, and noted that even she lives separately. Magnus said that Stephen didn't come, but he brought red ginseng yesterday, to which Eugene replied that he went to clear the dungeon with Oliver, so it would be for a few days. And then he told Penelope that she too would soon end up in a dungeon and on TV, which made the girl turn up her nose and say that she would blow everyone away and become a real rich woman. And then, releasing her frost power, she said that then she would buy a big house, and therefore it would be better for Eugene to live with her than with Magnus. Eugene replied that she would just freeze all the food now, and she didn't need to be like that because they had to get along in the future. The guy said that they would be going through rookie training together, and immediately Magnus and Penelope asked again in surprise, pointing at each other. Penelope got angry because they wouldn't be alone with Eugene, and Eugene, hearing a knock on the door, ran to open it. The guy started to open the door, shouting for the guys to calm down, and the man behind the door noticed that the guy had been cheerful since early morning. Eugene turned his head and saw Spencer, who handed him some paper and said that training began today. He said the schedule had changed, so he came personally to take them. And after some time, the guys, already changed, went down somewhere, and Spencer said that they would start with basic practice, since the person responsible for theory was a little late. The terrifying sounds of monsters could be heard from behind the bars as Spencer told them over the loudspeaker not to worry, as the essence of the practice was extremely simple. And then one of the monsters, sensing the victims, rushed to the bars. And then a whole crowd of them came running out, and Spencer said that all they had to do was defeat these monsters. Monsters that looked like moles and rats rushed towards Eugene and the others. Eugene, holding his weapon forward, shouted that this shouldn't happen during basic training. The monsters should appear one after another, while Penelope asked if they really just needed to defeat them. Spencer said over the loudspeaker that this was a practice of getting used to monsters. He said that the more contact they had with them, the faster they would get used to them. But Eugene didn't appreciate that idea. Taking a step forward, Penelope exclaimed that she would deal with them now. And then she instantly rushed forward with a spear in her hands. With the end of the spear, the girl began to accurately strike the small monsters. And then they gathered in huge piles, illuminated by bright lights, and Eugene, closing his eyes, said that it was very inspiring. After impaling several monsters on the spear, Penelope asked Eugene if they would taste good grilled. Eugene didn't appreciate this idea either, but Penelope enthusiastically said that the skills needed to be tested as well. There were footsteps behind Spencer, and a female voice noted that the girl was a real S-class, although she was a newbie, but her power was amazing. Spencer greeted the girl with a smile on his face. The girl asked if it was dangerous for newbies to fight so many monsters, to which the man, adjusting his glasses, told her not to worry. And he said he was afraid there wouldn't be enough monsters for the two of them. And in the meantime, Penelope froze the monsters, making something that looked like a Christmas tree. And then, from under a pile of its relatives, another monster appeared. With a vile squeal, the monster rushed at Magnus, who only cowered in fear. Eugene hurried to call out to the boy and tell him to put his spear in front of him and chop. But the next moment, the spear flew to the ground, and Magnus, fearfully calling for help, began to run away while the monster tried to catch up with him. Magnus ran as fast as he could, tears welling up in his eyes again as he cried out that this wouldn't do. Meanwhile, the monster was already catching up with the man, which he could not help but notice. The monster jumped up to attack the guy, but then Eugene appeared and pushed him away. Standing to his feet, Eugene cried out, asking how Magnus could throw his weapon away like that. And then he said that this monster is an F-class monster, the toothy mole, and it has poor vision, so it mostly moves in a straight line. Standing up, the guy said that even if he just swung his spear, he could cut this monster down. Meanwhile, Spencer watched what was happening with interest, and he said he was curious to see what Hunter Eugene would do. The man noticed that the guy was trying very hard. Of course, he knows about the monsters, and the contract he signed with Penelope can be considered standard for their field, but he may well be hiding something. Magnus worriedly asked the boy if everything would be okay, to which he confidently replied that there was no need to worry, because it was only F-class. Smiling, Magnus noted that Eugene was like an experienced hunter who had been in the business for several years. Hearing these words, Eugene finally thought about it. He wondered if it would be suspicious if he just killed the monster. And then, throwing the spear away, he decided that he would act like a newbie, and at the same time there would be less damage to Magnus's confidence. Eugene let out a frightened cry, and the mole climbed onto his back and began gnawing at his head. Spencer, continuing to watch, said that it seemed his eyes had deceived him. After some time, the doors of the training hall opened. Penelope walked out, energized and stretching her shoulders, saying she had worked out hard, while Eugene carried the nearly unconscious Magnus. Bursting into tears again, Magnus apologized to Eugene and said that the boy would need to support him as well. And Eugene noted that he had absolutely no predisposition for battle. Hearing this, Penelope turned around happily, exclaiming that she was indeed better than him. Eugene told the girl not to start this because they needed to get along. But before he could finish, Spencer came out and said that all three of them had done a great job. And he said that they had successfully completed the basic practice. The man remarked that Penelope had done admirably, but he could not say the same about the others, and Eugene, in a rage, exclaimed that he would tell his brother everything. He heard footsteps behind the man, and he turned around and said that tomorrow, as they had agreed, there would be theoretical training. And then he introduced Professor Hannah, who was responsible for the course of the classes. A beautiful girl with glasses and long black hair appeared in front of the others. Penelope noted with admiration that she was so young and already a professor, and Eugene exclaimed that he knew her. As it turns out, Hannah is an authority in the scientific circles of dungeon studies, a young genius who discovered a pattern in the appearance of dungeons after his trip to the United States. She became famous all over the world and was not nicknamed Dr. White, and Eugene addressed her as such. Leaning towards the guy, the girl said that she was not often called that, to which the guy replied that he was very interested in this area, and he himself wondered whether it was really not that well known yet. Hannah said that Eugene was indeed quite knowledgeable. She said that she had heard about him from the head of the personnel department. But before that, she wanted to say that she had heard about him from her uncle. And then Eugene snapped when the meaning of the words dawned on him. And he asked them with surprise whether they were relatives, to which Spencer asked to avoid misunderstandings, because Hannah works here not because he took advantage of his position. Smiling, the girl said that she would be working in the abyss for some time in connection with one investigation, and therefore she asked to take care of her. Eugene awkwardly shook the girl's hand, and he wondered if his time of youth was really beginning. Meanwhile, Oliver and Stephen were in the dungeon. Oliver asked the man if the monster was dead, to which he replied that it looked like it, since there was no visible reaction. There was a lion-like monster lying on the ground, and the people from the abyss were saying how great it was that their leader had resistance to fire. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to defeat him. Stephen asked the chief what they would do with him, and they looked under some rocks. As it turned out, there was a small kitten lying there, the child of that monster. When dungeons appeared in the world, it was like everyone was discovering fire for the first time. Half out of caution, half out of interest, they concentrated their attention on them. Those dungeons that were left unattended gradually became overcrowded and burst, causing monsters to pour out. Dungeon shock occurred due to the simultaneous breakthrough of dungeons. But in such a crisis, many have awakened special powers, or they began to invent new technologies using new materials, adapting to the changed world. In each country, an association of hunters was founded to control the awakened. Most hunters operate within an association or as part of a guild. Eugene sat at his desk, watching a film on the basics of hunter theory. He thought that now this prompted new thoughts. Hannah began to talk about how the level of awakening is determined by looking at skills in general. Looking at the materials, Eugene thought that the girl was giving a good lecture, but something was bothering him. He noted that they were given materials that were 5 years old, which is why there are a few errors. He immediately remembered one hunter who lived in terrible conditions, and it was thanks to them that she developed the skill of wooden vine. Eugene was thinking about how skills were different from inclinations or environment. Hannah interrupted him from his thoughts, asking him if she had made a mistake somewhere. The guy recoiled in fear, and the girl said that he was acting like her professor. And that means that there are mistakes somewhere, and she asked what those mistakes were. Eugene looked away and said that it was all just his guess. He said that she was talking about the skill being used in a critical situation for self-defense. But recently there has been an increase in the number of awakened whose skills have nothing to do with combat, so that doesn't fit. Previously, it seemed like this because the situation was in crisis due to constant dungeon breakouts. But in reality, there may be other factors that determine skills. Eugene awkwardly said that the girl could ignore it, thinking that nothing bad would happen from this bit of information. But then Hannah suddenly grabbed the guy by the hand, and she exclaimed that the guy even understands the tendency of showing skills, and therefore she is impressed. And then she started chattering, expressing her admiration and asking him to stay and talk to her for about 10 hours. Eugene decided to turn his attention to Penelope, so he asked her if she had any questions. A little later, the girl asked how S-class people make money. Smiling, Hannah replied that this was also a very important question. And then she pulled out a red money gun from somewhere. And the girl began to throw money out of it, saying that S-class hunters can earn $10 million a year. Eugene was glad that he had managed to change the subject. And continuing to throw money around, Hannah said that such payment seemed unnatural, since in all countries, S-class hunters could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Besides fighting monsters in creepy high-level dungeons and protecting security, they get something else too. They also receive items that are simply incredible in value. Sometimes even living magical beasts are found, and one of these ended up at Oliver's house, and Eugene asked him if he had really caught him in an S-class dungeon. Oliver replied that it was a horned lion cub, and he thought he could tame it and use it as a riding animal. Eugene noticed that the cub had one horn, scarlet fur, and a fox-like tail. It was a feat of unicorns, a Class 2 fiery horned lion with high characteristics and powerful fire skills.